South Park has been drawing the line between religion and cult since season 5, and most people never noticed. The show built a single working definition, tested it against Scientology, Christian rock, and warring atheist sea otters, and never once changed its answer. In this video, we break down South Park's battles against major cults, super best friends, Blaintology, and the show's first cult blueprint. Before South Park ever said the word Scientology out loud on screen, before it ever showed its audience the actual doctrine of an organization that had spent decades guarding its own teachings from public view, it had already built a complete working model of how a cult operates, wrapped inside an episode about a street magician and a mass suicide in the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool. Season 5 of South Park aired in the summer of 2001, and by that point, the show had already spent 4 years testing how far it could push satire of organized religion. It had mocked Catholics, Mormons, and the basic mechanics of mainstream Christianity across multiple episodes, always finding something specific to pull at rather than simply making a general joke about believers being gullible or confused. What the show had not done yet, at least not in a fully committed way, was build an entire episode around the internal machinery of a cult. Not a passing reference to cult behavior, not a single joke at the expense of someone acting like a true believer. A complete portrait of how a cult recruits, how it holds people, how it handles defectors, and what happens when the people in charge realize they have run out of ways to get what they want from the outside world. That episode is Super Best Friends, and it remains one of the most quietly precise pieces of social analysis the show has ever produced. All the more surprising for how little it gets discussed compared to the more famous religious satires that came after it. The plot follows Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny after they encounter street magician David Blaine performing in South Park. The real David Blaine was, at the time of the episode, one of the most famous illusionists in the world, known for public endurance stunts that drew enormous media attention, including a widely watched stunt where he encased himself in a block of ice in Times Square. The show uses his actual celebrity as the starting point, imagining what would happen if that kind of public fascination with a single performer tipped past admiration into something closer to religious devotion. The Blaine of the episode is not the careful, quiet street performer of real life. He is a showman who speaks in the cadence of a revival preacher, who frames his performances as miracles rather than tricks, and who invites his growing audience to join something rather than simply enjoy a show. The boys are immediately drawn in. Watching Blaine perform, they feel something they cannot quite name, a pull towards someone who seems to have access to a world more interesting than the ordinary one around them. They agree to attend one of his workshops for a fee of $69.95, a specific and deliberate price point that mirrors the kind of entry fee charged by real organizations that present themselves as self-improvement programs rather than religious bodies. What happens inside the workshop is where the episode begins doing its most careful and specific work. The new arrivals are greeted by a calm, pleasant spokesperson who asks them a series of questions that have no clear answers, vague philosophical prompts designed to leave participants feeling confused and slightly off balance. This technique is not invented for the episode. It is a real and documented recruitment method used by several actual organizations, designed to make newcomers feel that they lack something they need, creating just enough discomfort to make the solution being offered feel necessary rather than optional. Nobody walks into one of these sessions and feels immediately certain that they are being manipulated. The manipulation works precisely because it starts with a genuine question, one that most people would struggle to answer, and then positions the organization as the place where that question can finally be resolved. The boys, all except Stan, find this experience compelling rather than alarming. By the end of the workshop, they are fully committed members of what the episode calls the Blaintologists, ready to recruit others and dedicated to attending Blaine's major show in Denver. Stan is the one who notices something wrong almost immediately. His discomfort does not come from any specific piece of information. There is no single moment where he is told something shocking or is asked to do something obviously harmful. His unease is more subtle than that. He notices how quickly his friendships have shifted. Kyle, his closest friend, is suddenly more loyal to Blaine and to the group than he is to Stan, telling him that if Stan cannot accept the new beliefs, then the friendship is essentially over. This social mechanic, the replacement of existing relationships with loyalty to the group, is one of the oldest and most consistent features of cult behavior, and the episode captures it without ever needing to explain it in those terms. The audience sees it happening to Kyle and recognizes it, even if they have never read a single word about cult psychology. Stan leaving the group almost immediately after joining sets up the emotional engine the episode runs on for the rest of its runtime. He has to find a way to help his friends without any institutional support, without anyone willing to take take his concerns seriously, and without any real evidence to point to beyond his own instinct that something about the situation is wrong. This is another accurate detail. People who try to pull someone out of a cult-like group almost always face a version of the same problem Stan faces here. The person inside the group usually cannot see what the person outside can see, partly because the group has already reframed their outside relationships as threats rather than resources. Kyle does not think Blaine has changed him. From inside the group, Kyle thinks Stan is the one with the problem. The episode then introduces the plot development that gives the whole story its sharpest satirical edge. The Blaintologists begin petitioning the United States government for tax-exempt status, the legal classification that would allow them to operate as a recognized religion rather than simply a for-profit enterprise. This request is denied. Rather than responding by changing their approach or appealing the decision through legal channels, Blaine announces to all of his followers that the correct response is a mass suicide in Washington, organized to take place at the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool. The demand being made here through the threat of mass death is that the government recognize the group as a legitimate religion. If it does not, everyone dies and the government is responsible for that outcome. This sequence is a very specific and pointed reference to a real pattern in cult history, where the threat of self-destruction is used as leverage against external institutions the group believes are treating them unfairly. The Heaven's Gate cult, which ended in a mass suicide in California in 1997, had spent years framing its beliefs in terms of readiness to leave the physical world behind as an act of devotion rather than despair. The People's Temple mass death in Jonestown in 1978 had involved a community that had been in active conflict with American journalists, members of Congress, and government investigators before the final catastrophe occurred. The episode does not point directly at either of these real events by name, but the structure it uses, a charismatic leader, a group willing to die on command, a conflict with a government that refuses to grant the group the legitimacy it demands, draws on both of them clearly enough that any viewer familiar with either tragedy would recognize the shape being borrowed. What makes the reflecting pool sequence funny, despite the darkness underneath it, is the specific detail that the pool is only about a foot deep. The Blaintologists begin drowning themselves in water that barely reaches their ankles, faces pressed to the ground with a kind of absolute determination to die that runs completely counter to the physical reality of their situation. Kenny, who has already died dozens of times across the show's run, drowns himself in this same shallow water with the same solemn commitment as everyone around him. This image of adults fully committed to a lethal act in conditions that make the act nearly impossible captures something precise about the gap between the seriousness with which cult followers treat their group's demands and the view from outside, where those same demands can look not just harmful but absurd. Stan's response to this crisis is to seek help from the one figure in South Park who has any experience with the kind of problem he is facing. He goes to Jesus, who lives in town and hosts a public access television show, and asks for help rescuing Kyle and the others. Jesus, who has already tried to challenge Blaine through a public miracle demonstration and lost badly to Blaine's more impressive stage effects, realizes he cannot handle this alone. What follows is the introduction of the Super Best Friends, a team of major religious figures from multiple world traditions, brought together specifically to counter the power of a false leader who has turned his followers into a weapon against themselves. The Super Best Friends lineup is worth sitting with because the specific choices the show makes about who belongs in the group say something about the episode's argument. Jesus is there along with Buddha, Moses, Joseph Smith, Krishna, Laozi, and a character named Seaman, a clear parody of Aquaman. Muhammad is also present in the episode, a detail that would eventually become one of the most discussed aspects of the entire episode's history, given what happened later in the show's run around the question of depicting Muhammad in any form. In 2001, when the episode first aired, this appearance generated no meaningful controversy at all. The show placed Muhammad inside a team of heroic figures, and nobody called their network. 4 years later, following the Yulon's Poston cartoon controversy, the same image would carry an entirely different weight, and the episode eventually disappeared from the show's streaming library and official website as a direct result of the political situation around a completely different set of Muhammad depictions from a completely different source. The battle between the Super Best Friends and Blaine's cult ends with Blaine defeated and the followers freed from whatever hold the group had over them. Kyle reconciles with Stan, the mass suicide is stopped, and then Stan delivers the line that the entire episode has been building toward, the single sentence that contains everything the show wants to say about the difference between a religion and a cult. He announces to the assembled crowd that any religion which forces people to give up their money or control over their lives is really a cult. This line is simple enough to fit on a single line of dialogue. Simple enough that a 9-year-old character character can deliver it without it sounding out of place. But it contains a complete argument that took researchers, journalists, and former members of actual cults decades to articulate as clearly. The distinction between a religion and a cult has been debated seriously in academic and legal contexts for most of the 20th century, and the answers produced by those debates tend to be long, qualified, and difficult to summarize without losing something important. Stan's version of the argument strips all of that complexity away and replaces it with two concrete criteria: money and control. If an organization takes one or both of those things from its members under the pressure of belief, something has gone wrong, regardless of what the organization calls itself or how sincerely its members believe. This is also the first time the show states this particular argument explicitly, and it matters that it arrives at the end of an episode that has spent 20 minutes demonstrating the same point through plot rather than dialogue. The viewer has already watched Blaine's organization charge a fee to enter, use psychological techniques to disorient new members, demand total loyalty at the expense of outside relationships, and eventually threaten mass death to extract a legal privilege from a government that refused to grant it. By the time Stan says the line about money and control, the episode has already shown the audience 5 or 6 different ways the same principle applies to the story they have been watching. The dialogue does not teach the lesson. It names something the viewer has already been guided toward feeling for themselves across the runtime. The episode's afterlife contains a small and somewhat strange real-world detail that adds something to the picture. After Super Best Friends aired, the actual David Blaine called the South Park production office. His message, reported by the show's own fan resources, was that people had begun approaching him in public asking for his Blaintology book. The fictional document the show invented as a prop for the episode, a simple book with Blaine's face on the cover, described as containing the answers to deep philosophical questions, had apparently been treated by some viewers as a reference to something that might actually exist. People who had watched the episode genuinely asked the real person it was based on about a book that had never been written. This detail, small as it is, captures something important about how the episode works as satire, and how it connects to everything the show would do on this same subject in the years that followed. Satire depends on an audience being able to recognize the shape of something it already knows, translated into a different frame. The episode works because the audience has enough real-world knowledge of how cult recruitment operates to recognize Blaine's fictional workshops, the personality test-style questions, the entry fees, the isolation from outside relationships, the mass suicide as leverage. But the episode also relies on the audience maintaining enough distance from that recognition to laugh, rather than simply feel afraid. The people who called Blaine asking for the Blaintology book had lost that distance somewhere along the way, treating a prop from a joke as a real artifact, rather than a fictional stand-in for something the show was pointing at from a safe creative remove. This is a small version of the same gap the show would run into again much later, when real behavior connected to real episodes in ways that nobody inside the production had anticipated or intended. But in the specific case of Super Best Friends, the detail is mostly just strange rather than harmful, since asking a street magician about a book that does not exist causes nobody any real damage. It does, however, suggest that even the show's most clearly labeled fiction sometimes lands differently for different parts of its audience than the people who made it expected. What Super Best Friends establishes in its first season as part of this longer argument the show would develop across many more years is that the line between a recognized religion and a dangerous cult has less to do with the content of the belief system involved and more to do with the mechanics of how the organization operates. Blaine's followers believe in something, even if what they believe in is mostly performance rather than doctrine. Their belief is genuine, even if the object of that belief is a stage act. The episode never mocks the followers for believing. It mocks the organization for exploiting that belief through specific mechanisms: fees, isolation, psychological disorientation, and threats of collective death, that the show treats as consistent warning signs regardless of what any particular group claims to believe or who they claim to believe in. That distinction will carry through every major cult episode the show ever makes. The target is never the people inside the group and never the raw fact of belief itself. It is always the machinery surrounding the belief, the structure of control and extraction that certain organizations build on top of genuine human need and genuine human devotion, regardless of whether those organizations call themselves a church, a club, a self-improvement program, or something else entirely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Blaintology ends with a single line from a 9-year-old that contains the show's entire argument about cults. The next major entry in this story takes that same argument and points it directly at one of the most powerful and most litigious organizations in the American entertainment industry, this time with no fictional stand-in at all. Section 2. Trapped in the Closet. Scientology and the Cult of the Personality Test. 4 years after Super Best Friends gave the show its working definition of what separates a cult from a religion, South Park returned to the same argument with everything stripped away. No fictional stand-in. No borrowed celebrity name wrapped in a thin layer of creative distance. Season 9 looked directly at one of the most powerful and most carefully protected organizations in the American entertainment industry, described its actual internal doctrine to its audience without exaggeration, and then had a 9-year-old child stand up in front of that organization's leadership and call the whole thing a global scam. The episode is Trapped in the Closet, and the specific angle that connects it to everything Super Best Friends had set up 4 years earlier is not the controversy that followed it, not the casting decisions, and not the network decisions around the rerun schedule. It is the mechanics. The episode is built around showing its audience, step by step, exactly how an organization that has been described by critics and former members for decades as a cult actually brings someone inside, keeps them there, and eventually uses their presence to serve the organization's own financial interests rather than their personal needs. Every single step the show depicts mirrors something documented by researchers, journalists, and the organization's own former members across decades of investigation. Stan Marsh does not walk into the Church of Scientology looking for anything. This detail matters more than it might seem at first, because it establishes from the very beginning that what the episode is examining is not the vulnerability of someone in crisis, not the desperation of a person with no other options, not the loneliness of someone who has lost their community and is searching for a new one. Stan is simply walking down the street minding his business when members of the organization approach him and offer him something that sounds free and harmless. A personality test. Come in, sit down, answer some questions, find out more about yourself. There is no cost mentioned up front. There is no commitment being asked for. The pitch is entirely built around curiosity and self-knowledge rather than belief, because leading with belief would give the listener an easy way to decline based on whether they share that belief or not. Leading with self-knowledge removes that off-ramp entirely. Almost nobody turns down the chance to learn something about themselves. This specific recruitment technique, the free personality test used as the opening move in a longer process of bringing someone inside the organization, has been documented in connection with the Church of Scientology across many decades of journalism and legal testimony. The test itself is called the Oxford Capacity Analysis, despite having no actual connection to the University of Oxford. And the results it produces are specifically designed to suggest that the person taking it is suffering from a variety of personal problems that the organization can help address through its own programs. Former members and investigators have described the test as structured to produce negative results regardless of the actual answers given, ensuring that whoever takes it walks away feeling that they need something the organization can provide. The episode captures this mechanic almost exactly. Stan's results come back showing he is completely miserable and totally depressed, a finding that arrives with remarkable speed and remarkable certainty for a test he has just finished for the first time in his life. The response to these results is immediate and specific. Rather than suggesting that Stan see a doctor or speak with a counselor, the organization offers him a program called auditing, a process involving an e-meter, a device used by Scientology to measure what the organization calls thetan levels, and requiring Stan to hand over the money he has been saving for a new bike. This transition from the free personality test to the paid program is another documented feature of the organization's actual intake process, where the initial contact is free, but the path toward the promised improvement involves escalating financial commitments. The episode compresses this timeline significantly for the sake of comedy, but the basic structure it depicts, free hook followed by paid program followed by additional investment required at each subsequent level, matches what researchers and former members have described about how the organization operates in practice. What the show does with Stan's e-meter results is where the episode moves past the recruitment mechanics and into something both funnier and more pointed. The readings on Stan's device are not simply high, they are off the scale. Members of the organization who observe the test react with a combination of shock and reverence that escalates within seconds, from professional curiosity to something closer to religious awe. Their conclusion, delivered with the urgency of people who believe they have just witnessed a miracle, is that Stan might be the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the man who founded Scientology in the 1950s and who died in 1986. This moment is the episode's sharpest structural joke, because it takes the real organizational claim that Scientology is built around measurable spiritual progress and uses it against itself. If the e-meter is a genuine non-scientific instrument capable of detecting real spiritual states, and if the organization genuinely believes its founders' thetan levels were uniquely elevated, then the logical conclusion of those two beliefs is that someone who tests high enough must be that founder's reincarnation. The organization inside the episode follows that logic to its conclusion without a trace of irony, treating Stan as a figure of enormous spiritual authority the moment his numbers appear on a screen. Stan himself understands almost nothing about what is happening to him. He did not ask to be anyone's reincarnation. He walked in to take a test and is now being told that his results have changed the direction of a global religious organization. Being named the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard grants Stan access to information that normal members of the organization would spend years and significant amounts of money working toward. The show uses this access to do something almost no other television program had done up to that point in the show's history. It stops the plot entirely and presents the actual doctrine of Scientology's upper levels to its audience, calmly, completely, and without any added layer of fictional distortion. The screen displays a disclaimer stating plainly that what follows is what Scientologists actually believe, then walks the audience through the story of Xenu, an alien ruler from roughly 75 million years ago who brought billions of beings to Earth, destroyed them with hydrogen bombs inside volcanoes, and whose actions left spiritual traces that human beings still carry today. The show does not frame this material through the voice of a mocking character. The information is simply stated and shown as plainly as possible, while the disclaimer on screen reminds the audience that no exaggeration has been added. The choice to present this material without distortion deserves the same attention it received in the context of the show's history as Moral Panic, but for a completely different reason here. In the context of cult analysis, the decision to present the actual doctrine rather than a parodied version of it is doing something specific and important. One of the defining features of organizations that critics describe as cult-like is the use of graduated disclosure, revealing the full extent of their beliefs and practices only to members who have already made significant commitments of time and money. The Church of Scientology, in particular, has a long history of protecting its upper-level doctrine from public view, pursuing legal action against websites and publications that reproduce the material, and actively working to prevent outsiders from encountering information that members only access after years of involvement and tens of thousands of dollars in fees. By broadcasting that same information on basic cable to millions of viewers who have paid nothing and committed to nothing, the episode removes the organization's ability to control who learns what and when. It does exactly what the graduated disclosure model is designed to prevent, giving the full picture to an audience that has no emotional investment in the organization before they see it. The show had help being accurate about this material. According to reporting connected to the episode's production, investigative journalist Mark Ebner served as a consultant during the writing process. Ebner had already written extensively about Scientology in his book Hollywood Interrupted, which examined the organization's influence within the entertainment industry and included specific reporting on the experiences of high-profile members. Having someone with direct research experience involved in building the episode's depiction of Scientology's actual doctrine helps explain why the show felt confident enough to place the disclaimer on screen stating that nothing had been exaggerated. The claim was not a joke. The production had done real investigative work before putting the information on air. Stan's response to learning the organization's doctrine is to write a new one, an updated version that he believes would serve its members better. The specific change he proposes is the removal of the financial requirement for participation. No more fees, no more paid programs required at each level of progress. Scientology, in Stan's revised version, would be open to anyone willing to engage with it regardless of their ability to pay. The organization's president reviews this new doctrine with growing enthusiasm until he reaches the line about money, at which point his enthusiasm collapses completely. He pulls Stan aside and explains the actual situation to him with the directness that the rest of the episode has been building toward. The organization, the president explains, is a global scam. The purpose of the structure, the tests, the programs, the levels of attainment requiring escalating financial investment is not to help members achieve anything spiritually meaningful. It is to make money. The president's specific framing of this admission, delivered quietly and conspiratorially in a way that expects Stan to simply agree and get on board with the arrangement, treats the entire religious structure of the organization as a shared pretense that the people running it understand perfectly well is not what it claims to be. This is the moment where the episode connects most directly to the argument Super Best Friends had established 4 years earlier. Stan's line from that earlier episode described any religion that that takes your money or control of your life as a cult. Trapped in the Closet shows the person at the top of one of the world's most famous organizations openly describing exactly that arrangement to a child who just walked in off the street 2 days ago. Stan cannot go along with it. He walks back to the assembled membership of the organization, the same crowd that had been treating him as their returning prophet, and tells them the truth. He is not L. Ron Hubbard. He cannot tell them that their organization is legitimate. He has just been told by the man running it that the whole thing is a scam, and he is not willing to pretend otherwise. The organization's response to this admission is to threaten him with a lawsuit. Multiple members, along with celebrity followers depicted in the episode, tell Stan that they will sue him for making this claim. Stan responds to the threat with a line that became one of the most quoted pieces of dialogue from the entire episode, telling them plainly that he is not afraid of them, that they should go ahead and sue him, and that he is not scared. This ending is significant not just as a joke, but as a structural argument. The episode has spent its entire runtime walking the audience through a recruiting process that ends in a financial extraction system. It has shown how the organization uses the threat of legal action as its primary response to public criticism, rather than addressing the criticism on its own terms. And it resolves the story by having its central character simply refuse to be intimidated by that threat, stating clearly that the only power the threat actually has is the power the person receiving it is willing to give it. The show had specific reasons to be thinking about that kind of threat. The Church of Scientology has a documented and long history of using litigation, threatened litigation, and the financial and emotional burden of legal proceedings as a tool against critics and former members. This practice, sometimes described by researchers under the legal term strategic lawsuit against public participation, involves initiating or threatening legal action against people who speak critically about the organization, with the goal of exhausting their financial and emotional resources through the legal process itself, rather than necessarily winning the case on its merits. Several journalists, former members, and public commentators had faced this kind of pressure over the decades before Trapped in the Closet aired. By having Stan's closing moment be a direct refusal to be intimidated by a lawsuit threat, the episode was addressing a very specific, real behavior of the organization it was depicting, rather than simply writing a funny finish to a story about a kid who accidentally became a cult leader's spiritual successor. The episode also contains a detail about celebrity involvement in the organization that connects back to the cult analysis running underneath everything else the show does here. Several famous figures are depicted as devoted members of the Scientology within the episode's world, attending meetings, deferring to the organization's leadership, and ultimately joining the threatened lawsuit against Stan. One of them is depicted locking himself inside a closet and refusing to come out after being told he is not as talented an actor as someone he has always believed himself superior to. This sequence is funny as a piece of celebrity humor, but it also points at something real about how the organization functions within the entertainment industry specifically, where the combination of fame, wealth, and access to powerful figures inside a closed community can make leaving extremely costly in ways that go well beyond the spiritual. The organization's relationship with celebrity members has been analyzed seriously by researchers and journalists, examining how cults use high-status members to attract new followers, and to project an image of legitimacy to outsiders. Having someone with enormous public visibility committed to a group signals to potential members that the group must offer something real. If someone that successful, that intelligent, and that scrutinized by the public is a true believer, the reasoning goes, there must be something worth believing in. The episode quietly captures this dynamic by showing celebrity members being treated as simultaneously the organization's most valuable public assets and its most carefully managed internal relationships. People whose public devotion the organization needs and therefore works hard to protect and retain. Tying this back to the argument Super Best Friends established in season 5 makes the full picture of what the show has built across these two episodes clear. The earlier episode gave the audience the vocabulary, money, control, and the machinery that extracts both from people who walked in looking for something genuine. Trapped in the Closet puts that vocabulary into practice against a real and named target, showing how a personality test becomes a financial extraction pipeline, how spiritual authority is invented and then monetized, how legal threats become the organization's primary defense against honest description of its own operations, and how all of this can be revealed completely by a child who simply refused to pretend he had not just heard the man in charge explain that the whole thing was a scam. The definition from season 5 still holds. Any group that takes your money or control of your life is a cult. Season 9 spent 22 minutes proving it applies somewhere very specific specific, using real doctrine, real tactics, and a real organization's own documented behavior as the evidence. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Trapped in the Closet named its target directly and called it a scam from inside a 9-year-old's mouth. The next episode in this story could not name its target quite so plainly because the target had already left the building. What followed was the show's strangest and in some ways most painful entry in this whole argument, built from spliced audio and ending in a death brutal enough that many fans still find it difficult to watch. Section 3. The Return of Chef, Brainwashing, the Super Adventure Club, and the Cost of Leaving. 9 days after Isaac Hayes formally announced his departure from South Park, the show's season 10 premiere aired on Comedy Central. The timing was not coincidental. What Parker and Stone had built in the space between Hayes' resignation and that broadcast date was not a quiet farewell to a beloved character, not a graceful exit designed to preserve everyone's dignity, and not a neutral piece of television that happened to need a plot reason for Chef to disappear. It was a direct and fully committed argument about what happens to a person when a cult gets hold of them, built from audio spliced together from years of previous recordings, resolved through one of the most brutal character deaths the show has ever produced, and carrying a layer of real-world complication that would only become fully visible to the public a full decade after it first aired. To understand what the episode is doing and why it matters as an entry in the show's longer argument about cults, the situation surrounding Hayes' departure needs to be understood in the form it took at the time, rather than the fuller picture that emerged later. In March of 2006, the public version of events was relatively simple. Isaac Hayes, the legendary musician and longtime voice of Chef, had resigned from South Park, citing the show's treatment of religion as his reason for leaving. A press release issued in his name described a line between acceptable satire and intolerance that the show had crossed, and framed his departure as a principled stand by a civil rights activist who could no longer support content he found disrespectful to religious beliefs. Parker and Stone responded immediately and publicly. Matt Stone pointed out that Hayes had voiced Chef across 9 seasons, during which the show had mocked Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and virtually every other major religious tradition without Hayes ever raising a complaint. The objection, Stone argued, came specifically and only because the show had turned its attention to Scientology, the organization Hayes belonged to. Whatever Hayes might say publicly about a general objection to religious mockery, Stone's position was that the actual reason for the departure was the specific episode, and that the departure itself reflected something about how Scientology operated rather than a free and independent decision made by Hayes on his own terms. This framing of Hayes' exit as something done to him rather than by him, with Scientology functioning as the agent of the decision rather than Hayes himself, is the argument that the return of Chef turns into its entire plot. The episode does not depict Chef as someone who chose to leave his friends and his community because of a disagreement about values. It depicts him as someone who has been brainwashed. The mechanism of the brainwashing is a fictional organization called the Super Adventure Club, described as a worldwide travel group whose members journey to remote locations across the globe in order to do something genuinely harmful to the people they encounter there. The club's internal belief system is built around a doctrine invented specifically for the episode, explained through the same kind of calm, matter-of-fact narration the show had used in Trapped in the Closet to describe Scientology's actual upper-level teachings. A disclaimer appears on screen noting that this is what the Super Adventure Club actually believes, a direct callback to the earlier episode's use of the same framing device, making the parallel between the two organizations immediately clear to anyone who remembered how the earlier episode was structured. The Super Adventure Club's doctrine is designed to be obviously and completely indefensible. There is no version of the organization's beliefs that could be charitably interpreted as something a reasonable person might find appealing. This is a deliberate choice on the writer's part, and it represents a meaningful departure from how the show usually approaches even its sharpest targets. The Scientology episode presented a doctrine that was strange and that the show treated as absurd, but it presented it straight and let the audience draw their own conclusions. The Super Adventure Club's belief system is presented as not just wrong, but purely monstrous, with no redeeming dimension and no argument to be made in its favor. Parker and Stone were making a specific point through this choice, one that the episode itself underlines in how it handles the emotional resolution. Unlike the show's treatment of Mormonism, which ends by giving a Mormon character the last word and acknowledging that the community built around the faith has real value for the people inside it, the Super Adventure Club is given nothing comparable. There is no Gary Harrison moment here. There is no final speech acknowledging that even a flawed belief system can produce genuine goodness in the people who hold it. The organization organization is treated as purely destructive from beginning to end, because the writers were not actually trying to make an argument about the specific fictional organization they had invented. They were making an argument about Scientology, and they believed they had a specific and serious case to make. Chef's behavior when he first returns to South Park is immediately wrong in ways the boys can feel before they can name. He speaks in the warm, familiar cadences they remember, the voice that had greeted them with the same affectionate opening phrase across 9 years of the show. But layered into those familiar patterns are things that do not belong, comments that shift without warning into something disturbing and entirely out of character. The contrast between the voice the audience knows and loves and the content coming out of it is one of the episode's most technically interesting achievements, because the voice is literally constructed from real recordings of Isaac Hayes from earlier episodes. Parker and Stone took years of Chef's existing dialogue and cut it together to create the character's lines for this final appearance, producing something that sounds genuinely like Hayes while saying things Hayes never actually said in that context. The result is uncanny in a specific way, familiar and wrong at the same time, which is exactly the effect the episode needs to make its argument about brainwashing land. Brainwashing, as the show depicts it here and as researchers who study cult dynamics have described it in real contexts, does not erase a person entirely. It does not replace them with someone unrecognizable. What it does, at its most effective, is layer a new set of loyalties, responses, and behaviors over the existing personality, leaving enough of the original person visible to maintain relationships while redirecting the person's fundamental commitments toward the organization. Chef still sounds like Chef. His warmth, his affection for the boys, his familiar way of speaking are all still there, but underneath those familiar qualities, something has been redirected. His loyalty now runs toward the Super Adventure Club, rather than toward the community that had been his home for 9 years, and no amount of the boys' emotional appeals to the person they know can get through that redirection, at least not reliably or permanently. The boys figure out fairly quickly that Chef has been brainwashed, and they spend much of the episode trying to undo the damage through a combination of deprogramming attempts. A psychiatrist is consulted and offers the somewhat unorthodox suggestion that the best path back to Chef's original self is through the things he loved before the club got hold of him. The boys take Chef to a strip club, and the approach almost works. There is a moment where Chef surfaces, genuinely himself again, apologizing to the boys and seeming to understand what has happened to him. This moment is short. The Super Adventure Club arrives almost immediately and retakes him, and the window closes. This sequence is doing real work beneath the comedy. One of the most documented and most painful features of trying to help someone leave a cult-like organization is exactly this pattern. The person breaks through briefly, seems to recognize the situation clearly, connects emotionally with the people trying to help them, and then the connection is lost again almost before it fully forms. This is not because the person is stupid or does not care about the people reaching out to them. It is because the organization has spent significant time and effort building a structure of belief and loyalty that does not dissolve the moment someone outside the structure says the right thing. Recovery from that kind of intensive psychological restructuring, when it happens at all, tends to be slow and often involves setbacks that look exactly like what happens to Chef in this episode. One moment of clarity, followed by recapture. The boys rescue Chef from the club's headquarters and begin crossing a rope bridge to freedom. On the other side, the club's leader calls out to Chef and reminds him of why he left his old life to join them in the first place. He had been seeking adventure. His life had begun to feel small and repetitive, and the club had offered him something that seemed much larger. Stan tells Chef they love him. Chef turns back. The bridge is struck by lightning almost immediately. What happens next is the most violent and graphically detailed death the show has ever depicted for a main character, and it was clearly written with a specific emotional temperature that went beyond the show's usual treatment of Kenny's frequent and consequence-free deaths. Chef falls, catches fire, hits rock formations on the way down, is impaled on a branch, and is then attacked by both a mountain lion and a grizzly bear before one of the club's own members accidentally shoots him. The Super Adventure Club retrieves what is left and resurrects him as a figure clearly designed to evoke Darth Vader, a villain version of the character who now fully embraces the club's philosophy. The brutality of this death was noticed immediately by viewers and critics, many of whom felt it crossed a line in how it treated a character who had been genuinely beloved across 9 seasons of the show. Looking back at it in light of what became known later about Hayes' actual circumstances during this period, makes the sequence feel considerably heavier than it did at the time. In 2016, Hayes' son Isaac Hayes III gave an interview in which he stated directly that his father had not quit South Park of his own free will. jail. Hayes had suffered a stroke in January of 2006, leaving him significantly impaired in the weeks before the press release announcing his departure was issued. According to his son, the decision to leave was made by people connected to Scientology who were around his father during that period, acting in his name during a time when Hayes himself was not in a condition to be making major career decisions independently. The press release, the public statement that became the accepted story of why Chef left South Park, may not have reflected anything Hayes himself had chosen or approved. This means the episode's entire argument, its framing of Chef as a brainwashed person whose departure was caused by a cult rather than chosen freely, may have been more accurate to what actually happened than even Parker and Stone understood at the time they wrote it. They believed Hayes was being pressured by Scientology, and that his departure was not a genuinely free decision. They were apparently correct. The specific mechanism they imagined, an organization exercising control over a member in ways that override his own judgment and redirect his loyalties away from the people who care about him, appears to describe something close to what was actually happening to Isaac Hayes during the period in question. The episode, written as a bitter response to what the creators believed was happening, turned out to be a more precise document of events than anyone involved in making it could have fully known. The eulogy Kyle delivers at Chef's funeral is the emotional center of the episode, and the place where the show's argument about cults becomes most direct and most personal. Kyle tells the assembled mourners that they should not blame Chef for what happened at the end. They should remember who Chef was before the Super Adventure Club got hold of him, the person he had been across all the years they had known him, not the version of him that walked back toward the club on that bridge. The person who died is not the person who deserved to be mourned. The one who deserves to be mourned is the one who existed before, the one the organization took away from them. What the club did to Chef, Kyle argues, is what they should direct their anger toward, not Chef himself. This distinction between the person before the cult's influence and the person shaped by it is one of the most important and most difficult ideas in any serious discussion of how cult involvement affects individuals and their relationships. Families of people inside cult-like organizations frequently describe exactly the experience Kyle is articulating. The sense that the person they knew is still in there somewhere, that the behavior they are seeing is not a true expression of who the person actually is, and that the organization is the correct target for their grief and anger, rather than the person who has been shaped by it. Parker and Stone put that specific and complicated emotional reality into the mouth of a 10-year-old child at a cartoon funeral, and somehow it lands. The episode also does something sharp through the disclaimer it places on screen during the Super Adventure Club's doctrine explanation, the same framing device used in Trapped in the Closet to introduce Scientology's actual upper-level teachings. The plain text statement that this is what the organization actually believes appears again here. This time it is not attached to real doctrine. The Super Adventure Club's beliefs are invented entirely for the episode. By using the same visual language for fictional content that the earlier episode had used for genuine documentary information, the show is drawing the comparison deliberately, inviting the audience to notice that the fictional cult structure and the real organization structure share the same basic shape regardless of the specific content of their respective belief systems. The disclaimer, applied this time to something obviously made up, draws attention to what the device is actually doing in both cases, telling the audience to pay attention to the machinery rather than getting lost in the specifics of what any particular group happens to believe. What the return of Chef adds to the show's longer argument about cults is the human cost of leaving. Super Best Friends showed recruitment and extraction. Trapped in the Closet showed doctrine, financial mechanics, and the legal threat used to silence critics. This episode shows what happens to someone who is taken in by an organization that exercises that kind of control, viewed from the perspective of the people who loved them before the organization arrived. Chef does not die because he was evil or because he made a series of obviously bad choices. He dies because he walked towards something that looked like adventure and found something that would not let him go. And because the people trying to pull him back from it were not powerful enough to hold him against the pull in the other direction. That outcome, watched through the grief of 4 children at a funeral for someone who used to make them chocolate salty balls and give them life advice wrapped in inappropriate metaphor, turns the show's cult argument into something that feels less like analysis and more like loss. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The return of Chef showed the human cost of cult involvement through grief and a brutal ending. The next entry in the story moves the argument to completely different ground, asking not what a cult does to its members, but what happens when a 9-year-old boy discovers that fear of eternal punishment is the most effective recruiting tool ever ever invented, and decides to use it entirely for profit. Section 4. Do the handicapped go to hell? / probably, Cartman's Church and the Economics of Fear. Every cult in South Park's history has a moment where the mask slips. David Blaine's mask slips when the government denies his tax-exempt status and he orders his followers to drown themselves in a shallow pool. The Scientology president's mask slips when he pulls Stan into a back room and explains that the entire organization is a financial extraction system dressed in spiritual language. In the two-part Season 4 story that begins with "Do the handicapped go to hell?" and concludes with "Probably," the mask slips almost immediately because the person wearing it is 9 years old, has the impulse control of someone who has never once been told no in a way that actually stuck, and cannot resist showing Stan and Kyle the enormous pile of cash he has accumulated inside the church rectory before enough time has passed to make the scheme truly secure. Eric Cartman becoming a cult leader is, in retrospect, one of the most inevitable things the show ever did. Every quality that makes him the show's most dangerous and most compelling character, his total indifference to the well-being of other people, his uncanny ability to read what someone needs and offer a version of it designed to serve himself, his complete comfort with saying whatever a situation requires regardless of its relationship to the truth, and his deep, almost academic understanding of how persuasion works even at age 9, these are not just personality flaws. They are a precise inventory of the skills that define the most successful cult leaders across modern history. The episode does not frame Cartman's foray into religious leadership as a surprising development. It treats it as the natural destination of a character who has been practicing the underlying techniques across 4 seasons of increasingly elaborate schemes, applied here to the specific and enormously fertile territory of children who have just been told they might be going to hell. The setup requires understanding what puts the children of South Park in the emotional condition the episode exploits. Father Maxey, the town's Catholic priest, delivers a fire and brimstone sermon that lands on the boys with the weight of something they had not previously considered in any serious way. The sermon is not a nuanced theological argument. It is a direct and unqualified threat, delivered with the full authority of an adult religious figure speaking to children who have been told from infancy that this particular adult has a special connection to information about the afterlife. Hell is real, Maxey tells them. People go there. The specific requirements for avoiding it involve confession, communion, and baptism, a set of rituals that suddenly feel urgently necessary to a group of 9-year-olds who have, by their own accounting, accumulated a significant backlog of sins they have never formally addressed. The boys' panic is immediate and genuine. This is not the exaggerated comedic panic the show often deploys for small-stake situations. These children are genuinely frightened, in the specific way that only children confronted with the reality of death and eternal consequence can be frightened, without the emotional distance that adults develop over time through repeated encounters with the same fear. They go to Sunday school. They try to understand the rules. They discover almost immediately that the rules, as they understand them, are going to send several of their closest friends straight to hell, regardless of anything those friends actually did, simply because of circumstances of birth and disability that were never within their control. Kyle is Jewish. Timmy can say almost nothing beyond his own name. Neither of these facts is something that can be easily addressed through the standard Catholic procedures the boys have just been told are required. The discovery that Father Maxey himself is not following any of the rules he has just threatened them with is the trigger for everything that follows. The boys find their priest in a situation that makes his entire authority on the subject of sin and consequence collapse in an instant. The institution they were counting on to help them navigate the sudden terror of eternal judgment has just revealed that the person running it locally operates by an entirely different standard than the one being enforced on everyone else. This is not an abstract theological crisis. To a group of 9-year-olds who have just been told the stakes are infinite, discovering that the authority figure responsible for managing those stakes is not actually following the rules is an existential problem with no obvious solution. Cartman's solution arrives almost immediately, delivered on a street corner with a bullhorn and a borrowed southern preacher accent that he will continue developing across the next 2 decades of the show's run. The children of South Park, Cartman announces, are going to save themselves. The institutional church has failed them. The adults are not going to help. The only resource available to them is whatever they can build on their own, led by whoever among them is willing to step forward and take charge. What Cartman is doing in this moment is a recognizable move, one that appears across the history of actual cult formation again and again. The first step is not selling a belief system. The first step is identifying a group of people whose existing source of institutional support has just failed them, pointing at that failure clearly and positioning yourself as the alternative. The belief system comes later, after the emotional need for an alternative has already been established. The church the children build is not an especially impressive structure. It is a messy collection of boards and scrap material assembled by a group of fourth graders working without adult supervision. None of that matters to the children who begin attending it, because what they are looking for is not architectural quality. They are looking for the same thing people have always looked for in religious community: someone who seems to know what the rules are, someone who will tell them they are going to be all right if they follow those rules, and a group of peers who are frightened of the same things they are and are seeking the same reassurance. Cartman provides all three of these things, with a degree of performative confidence that a real televangelist would respect. The specific techniques Cartman uses inside his church are lifted directly from the most commercially successful end of American evangelical broadcasting. He has been watching televangelists on television, and the episode shows him absorbing their methods with the focused attention of someone taking notes for a practical application, rather than watching for entertainment. The exaggerated southern cadence, the dramatic pauses before key words, the physical performance of divine power through faith healing, where he places his hand on a child's forehead and commands whatever affliction they carry to leave their body, with the theatrical certainty that the command will work because he is the one delivering it. None of these techniques require any actual divine authority to function. They require performance, repetition, and an audience that is already predisposed to want them to work. Cold reading appears early and is deployed with remarkable effectiveness for someone with no formal training in the technique. Cartman identifies a child in the congregation who is wearing thick glasses and announces that God is telling him this child has poor eyesight. The congregation responds with wonder. The trick here is not sophisticated. It is simply an observation dressed in the language of revelation, the same move that actual cold reading practitioners use when they tell an audience member something that appears impossibly specific but is actually derived from a visible physical detail that anyone paying attention could have noticed. What makes it effective is the frame surrounding it. Inside a religious service, where the possibility of divine communication has already been established as the premise everyone has agreed to accept, a piece of obvious inference gets processed as evidence of genuine connection to something supernatural. The congregation grows. Word spreads through the children of South Park that Cartman's church is providing what Father Maxey's failed them in delivering: accessible, immediate, emotionally satisfying engagement with the question of how to avoid hell. Children begin bringing offerings. They construct plans for a larger building. The organization that started as a response to institutional failure is becoming its own institution, complete with a leadership structure centered entirely on one person and a financial model based entirely on the congregation's fear of what happens if they stop contributing. Stan and Kyle figure out the scam relatively quickly. Cartman does not bother denying it when they confront him. He walks them into the rectory, shows them the cash, and explains with complete transparency that this has always been a scheme to reach $10 million by using other children's fear of eternal punishment as the mechanism for transfer. He acknowledges that all of his previous attempts to reach that financial target through other means have failed, and positions the church as simply his most recent and most effective tool for the same goal he has always been pursuing. The confession is delivered without guilt, without hesitation, and without any apparent awareness that Stan and Kyle might expect him to feel bad about it. Cartman does not feel bad about it. The only question that ever mattered to him was whether it was working, and the pile of money in the rectory answers that question clearly enough. This moment is the episode's clearest and most direct statement about the relationship between cult leadership and genuine belief. Cartman does not believe anything he has been preaching. He has never believed any of it. Every sermon, every faith healing, every claimed communication from God has been a performance executed with the specific goal of moving money from frightened children into his own possession. And yet, the children giving him that money are not stupid. They are not uniquely gullible compared to adults in the same situation. They are simply frightened. And frightened people across every age group, across every level of education, and across every historical period have been shown repeatedly and consistently to be vulnerable to exactly the dynamic the episode depicts. Someone with confidence, with the language of authority, with the right performance of connection to something larger than the ordinary world, can extract money and loyalty from frightened people without possessing any actual authority at all, simply by performing it convincingly enough in the right conditions. What makes Cartman's church particularly pointed as a piece of cult analysis is the specific fear being exploited. The show is not depicting a generic spiritual emptiness being filled by a charismatic leader. It is depicting something more specific and more historically grounded: the use of hell as a motivational motivational tool. The threat of infinite punishment for finite failures is one of the most powerful psychological levers available to anyone trying to control behavior through fear rather than through genuine persuasion. It is infinite in its stakes, which means no finite cost of compliance can outweigh it. It is impossible to verify or disprove, which means the person making the threat cannot be held accountable for the accuracy of the claim through any ordinary standard of evidence. And it is applied specifically to behaviors and relationships that can be monitored and managed by the authority figure making the threat, giving that figure direct leverage over the daily decisions of everyone inside the community. Father Maxey uses this lever first and uses it carelessly, applying it to situations like Kyle's Judaism and Timmy's disability, where it produces obvious injustice and no practical path to resolution. Cartman picks up the same lever and uses it far more skillfully because he has no actual theological commitments clouding his approach. He only needs the lever to keep producing the behavior he wants, which is continued financial contribution. So he deploys it in whatever way best serves that specific goal. This is not an accident of character. It is the episode pointing at something true about how the most effective exploitation of religious fear tends to work in practice. The person most skilled at using spiritual terror as a control mechanism is often not someone who genuinely believes the threat themselves, because genuine belief introduces its own complications and inconsistencies. The most effective deployment of the threat is often by someone who understands it as a tool rather than a truth, who can shape and adjust it based on what the audience needs to keep responding the way the leader requires. Jesus eventually arrives at Cartman's church, invited by Sister Anne, who has been watching the situation develop with increasing concern. The resolution Jesus offers is significant because of what it contradicts rather than what it simply adds. He tells the gathered children that God does not actually want them to be afraid of hell as a constant motivating force in their daily lives. The entire premise of Cartman's church, the idea that fear of eternal punishment should be the central organizing principle of how these children spend their time and energy and money, is presented by the actual figure whose authority Cartman borrowed as a misunderstanding of what the belief system is supposed to produce. God wants people to live good and happy lives, Jesus explains. The fear was never the point. This resolution does something careful. By having Jesus show up and correct the record personally, the episode is not arguing against Christianity or against religious community as such. It is drawing a very specific line between a genuine spiritual tradition and a cult built from that tradition's most coercive elements. Cartman's church took the fear and the authority and the financial structure and left out everything the tradition also contains about care, community, meaning, and ethical obligation toward other people. What remained was a control mechanism with the wrapping of a religion, but none of the substance. Jesus showing up to point this out is the episode making explicit what it has spent its entire runtime demonstrating through Cartman's behavior. A cult is what you get when the machinery of religious authority is operated entirely for the benefit of the person running it, rather than the people inside it. Cartman ends up sent to Ensenada by Jesus as a consequence. Stan stands outside the now empty church and expresses relief that the ordeal is over, saying that at least they all learned an important lesson. Kyle disagrees flatly, saying they learned absolutely nothing. This ending mirrors the resolution of Super Best Friends almost exactly, in its refusal to deliver a clean moral takeaway to the audience. The cult is over, the leader is gone. Nobody has fundamentally changed the underlying vulnerability that allowed the whole situation to develop in the first place. The children of South Park were frightened into a cult by a priest, then exploited inside that cult by a classmate, and by the end of the episode, nothing about how either the institutional church or the specific children involved approached the original question of fear and death and eternity has been meaningfully addressed. The conditions that made the cult possible in the first place are all still present. That unresolved ending is the episode's most honest moment, and the one that connects it most directly to what the show keeps finding across every version of this argument. Cults do not form in a vacuum. They form in the space created by failed institutions, unaddressed fear, and the specific combination of emotional need and missing support that makes a confident voice with simple answers feel like the most rational option available. Getting rid of one cult leader does not close that space. It just leaves it open for the next one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Cartman's church showed what a cult looks like when the leader never believed a single word he preached. The next entry in the story asks a harder and more uncomfortable question. What does it look like when the belief is completely genuine, the community it builds is genuinely loving, and the line between cult and religion becomes almost impossible to find? Section 5. All about Mormons, where religion ends and the cult question question begins. The question is not whether Scientology is a cult, or whether Cartman's fake church is a cult, or whether David Blaine's fictional Blaintology is a cult. Those answers are obvious enough within the context of each episode that stating them feels almost redundant. The harder question is where the line actually sits between a cult and a legitimate religion, and whether that line is as clear and as stable as most people assume it is when they use both words with confidence in ordinary conversation. Season 7 of South Park, which aired in 2003, gave that question its most sustained and most careful examination through an episode that manages to be simultaneously one of the sharpest critiques of a religious founding story the show has ever produced, and one of the most genuinely warm portraits of religious community anywhere in the show's history. The episode is all about Mormons, and its approach to the cult question is so different from everything the show had done on this subject before it that understanding what makes it distinctive requires sitting with the episode's actual structure, rather than simply noting that it mocks a religion and moving on. A new family moves to South Park from Utah. Their son Gary is introduced to the other boys on his first day at school, and within minutes the boys have decided that he needs to be beaten up. Not because Gary has done anything threatening or offensive, precisely because he has done the opposite. He is unfailingly polite, academically accomplished, good at sports, and possessed of a warmth toward the people around him that the other boys find immediately suspicious. This reaction, the instinct to treat exceptional kindness as a form of aggression requiring a physical response, is one of those small observations about how social groups actually function that the show makes better than almost any other television program in its history. The boys are not wrong that Gary's behavior is unusual. They are wrong about what that unusualness means and what the correct response to it is. Stan is dispatched to carry out the beating and discovers, as he approaches Gary on the playground, that it is almost impossible to be hostile towards someone who responds to every form of aggression with genuine warmth and zero defensiveness. Gary invites Stan to dinner. Stan goes partly out of confusion and partly out of a social momentum that has overtaken his original intention before he quite realizes what has happened. The Harrison family dinner is where the episode establishes the specific quality that will drive its argument for the rest of the runtime. The Harrisons are genuinely nice, not performing niceness as a social strategy, not using warmth as a form of manipulation, not friendly in the slightly aggressive way that can feel like an attempt to overwhelm someone's resistance, simply and consistently kind, in a way that makes everyone around them feel welcome and respected and liked. This portrait of the Mormon family as genuinely good people is not incidental to the episode's argument. It is the argument's foundation, and everything the show does with the founding story of Joseph Smith and the historical claims of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints only makes sense in relation to it. The show is not interested in the simple version of this subject, which would be mocking Mormons for believing something that sounds strange and leaving it at that. It is interested in the much harder version, which is what to make of a community that produces genuinely admirable people and genuinely loving family structures on the basis of a founding story that, when examined closely, raises serious and uncomfortable questions about how it was assembled and what its original purpose might have been. The founding story is told through a running musical sequence that uses an extremely simple tune, variations on a single repeating musical phrase that comments on each new development in the narrative by alternating between a version that sounds like affirmation and a version that sounds like gentle mockery. As the story of Joseph Smith unfolds, the tune shifts between these two registers depending on whether the narrative has reached a moment the show treats as straightforwardly positive or one that it finds difficult to accept at face value. The technique allows the show to maintain two simultaneous attitudes toward the same material, taking the human experiences within the story seriously while keeping the epistemological questions clearly in view, without collapsing one attitude into the other. The story itself covers the key claims of the Mormon founding tradition. Joseph Smith, a young man in upstate New York in the early 19th century, reported being visited by an angel named Moroni, who directed him to the location of a set of golden plates buried in a hillside. Smith said he used a set of special stones to translate the plates into what became the Book of Mormon, doing so while the plates themselves were hidden from view behind a curtain or held inside a hat, with the scribe recording his spoken translation on the other side. The original manuscript was then lost by a follower named Martin Harris, after Harris's wife, skeptical of the whole enterprise, demanded to see it as proof that the project was real. Smith's response to the loss was to produce a second translation that differed from the first, explaining that God had arranged this outcome in advance to prevent anyone from claiming the two versions were different and using that difference to discredit the work. Each of these moments performance is presented by the show with a specific visual and musical commentary that does not require any dialogue to communicate its meaning. The stones used for translation produce a reaction from the onlooking characters that ranges from bewilderment to frank disbelief. The disappearance of the original manuscript and the explanation offered for it produces an expression on the face of the animated Martin Harris that captures precisely the face a reasonable person makes when they are being given an explanation that answers every objection in a way that conveniently forecloses the possibility of independent verification. The show does not editorialize through dialogue. It editorializes through animated facial expressions and musical tone, letting the audience arrive at their own conclusions while making those conclusions very easy to reach. None of this is inaccurate. The episode was built with real knowledge of Mormon history, and multiple sources connected to both Parker and Stone confirmed that the research behind it was genuine rather than casually assembled. Parker grew up in Colorado knowing many Mormon people, had a Mormon high school girlfriend whose family he had visited during family home evening, and had worked on a film years earlier in which he played a Mormon missionary himself. The writer who voiced the character of Gary McCulloch also grew up Mormon. The historical claims the episode makes about the founding of the church are not invented satirical distortions. They are simplified but substantively accurate accounts of what Mormon teaching and Mormon history actually describe. Presented with the same calm commitment to factual grounding the show had brought to its Scientology episode 2 seasons later. Where the episode differs from the Scientology episode in everything that matters is the conclusion it draws. Trapped in the Closet ends with a child calling the organization he has been examining a global scam, describing its president openly admitting that the whole structure is designed to extract money rather than to serve its members. All About Mormons ends with Gary Harrison, the Mormon boy whose family has been the subject of scrutiny throughout the episode, delivering a speech that turns the entire argument on its head. Stan has spent the episode building toward a confrontation. He is convinced that the founding story of Mormonism cannot survive scrutiny, and he is right that the specific historical claims involved resist the kind of independent verification that most people would expect before accepting them as fact. He delivers his objections to the Harrison family directly, telling them that their beliefs are built on a story that cannot be proven, and that a reasonable person examining the evidence should reject. The Harrisons absorb this calmly as they absorb almost everything Stan says throughout the episode. But Gary does not simply absorb it. The next morning, he finds Stan at the bus stop and responds. The response Gary gives is one of the most carefully constructed pieces of writing in the entire run of the show, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives. He does not defend Joseph Smith's claims as literally true. He does not pretend the historical objections Stan has raised are invalid. He acknowledges, directly and without any apparent distress, that the founding story of his religion might not be factually accurate in every particular, and that a reasonable person could look at the evidence and conclude that Joseph Smith invented the whole thing. Having made that acknowledgement, he then states plainly that none of it changes anything about what he values or how he lives. His family is happy. His community is loving. His life is structured around values that have produced good outcomes for the people around him. Whether Joseph Smith found golden plates or made the whole story up, the tradition built from that founding has given him something real and genuinely valuable, and he does not require the historical claims to be scientifically verifiable in order to value the community and the life that have grown from them. He then turns the argument back on Stan with a directness that the rest of the episode has been preparing for without quite showing its hand. Stan has spent the evening insulting a family that was nothing but kind to him, dismissing beliefs he does not share without considering what those beliefs have produced for the people who hold them, and positioning his own skepticism as a form of superior intelligence rather than simply a different relationship to evidence. Gary tells him that Stan has a lot of growing up to do, and that he is no longer interested in pursuing the friendship, and then delivers the episode's closing line in language that the show allows to land without softening it in any way. This ending does something specific to the cult question that the show has been building across multiple seasons. Every previous episode in this series has worked by identifying a clear mechanism of exploitation: recruitment through deception, financial extraction through manufactured vulnerability, brainwashing of a member who tries to leave, theatrical authority used to profit from manufactured fear, and then demonstrating how that mechanism operates on real people in real circumstances. All About Mormons does not find that mechanism. The Harrison family is not being exploited. Gary is not frightened into belief. Nobody is taking their money in exchange for protection from a threat the organization itself has manufactured. The community built around their faith has produced people who are, by any observable measure, doing better than most of the people around them. This creates a genuine problem for the clean clean version of the cult question, the one where the answer is always that any belief system with a sufficiently strange founding story is dangerous, and any organization built around such a story is exploitative. The Harrisons are evidence that the founding story and the community built from it can come apart in ways that matter. The story might be false, or it might not be, and the community built from it is genuinely valuable regardless of which answer turns out to be correct. Gary's speech is the show acknowledging that the mechanisms it has been identifying across its religious episodes, the fear, the financial extraction, the brainwashing, the legal threats, the manipulation, do not attach automatically to any particular belief system simply because that belief system's founding claims cannot be independently verified. What makes a cult in the show's accumulated argument across these episodes is not the content of its theology. It is the machinery surrounding that theology. The machinery that demands money in exchange for spiritual progress. The machinery that isolates members from outside relationships and reframes those relationships as threats. The machinery that responds to criticism with legal threats rather than argument. The machinery that cannot tolerate a member asking to leave without consequence. None of those machines are running inside the Harrison household. Gary is allowed to have friends who are not Mormon. His family does not take Stan's skepticism as a threat requiring a response. Nobody tries to extract money from Randy in exchange for a higher level of access to the church's inner teachings. The community functions as a community rather than as an extraction system, and that difference is the one the show treats as the thing that actually matters. This is also where the episode connects back to Stan's line from Super Best Friends, the definition the show stated plainly 4 years before All About Mormons aired. Any group that takes your money or control of your life is a cult. The Harrison family's church does neither. It asks for participation and commitment, which every genuine community does, but it does not confiscate judgment, isolate members from outside relationships, or monetize belief in a way that serves the organization at the expense of the member. By that standard, whatever questions remain about the founding story, the community the show depicts is not a cult. It is a religion. The line between the two, which trapped in the closet located inside the financial admission of an organization's president, is located here, inside the simple difference between a community that serves its members and an organization that extracts from them. The episode was received with genuine warmth by many Mormon viewers, something that surprised some of the show's regular audience given how directly the founding story sequences mock the specific historical claims of the church. The response that most surprised outside observers was the church's own reaction to Parker and Stone's later Broadway musical, The Book of Mormon, which extends many of the same arguments in a much longer format. When the musical opened, the church purchased advertising in the playbill describing it as a production the audience might enjoy, and suggesting they then go read the actual Book of Mormon afterward. This response, using a satirical takedown of the church's own founding story as an opportunity to direct curious new audiences toward the source material, is exactly the kind of institutional confidence that the show's treatment of Mormonism has always distinguished from the organizations it treats as genuinely cult-like. An organization that can absorb that kind of scrutiny and respond by pointing new people toward its own teachings is not one that depends on controlling what its members and potential members are allowed to know about it. That transparency is itself a form of evidence about the difference between the two categories the show has been building across its entire religious catalog. All About Mormons does not resolve the cult question. The question it raises about where exactly the line sits between a founding story that is hard to verify and an organization that uses those verification problems as a mechanism of control is not one the show pretends to answer definitively. What the episode does instead is demonstrate that the question has to be asked separately from the founding story itself, that the founding story's plausibility is not the relevant variable, and that a community built around even the strangest historical claims can still be genuinely serving its members if the machinery running beneath the theology is built to give rather than to take. Gary Harrison has the last word not because the show agrees that Joseph Smith definitely found golden plates. He has the last word because the show believes the argument about what makes a community valuable cannot be settled by archaeology alone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. All About Mormons drew the line between cult and religion through the machinery surrounding belief rather than the content of the belief itself. The next entry in this story moves the argument to the very edges of organized faith, into the internal fringe of an established tradition, asking what happens when one member of a recognized religious community decides the mainstream version of their own tradition has it wrong, and builds something far darker in its place. Section 6. Jubilee. The cult inside the religion. The Super Adventure Club exists entirely as a fictional invention with no connection to any real tradition. David Blaine's Blaine Scientology is built from scratch around a single charismatic figure with no theological heritage behind him. Even Cartman's fake church, for all its borrowings from evangelical Christianity, is clearly positioned as a parasitic imitation of an institution rather than a genuine outgrowth of one. Each of these targets sits outside recognizable mainstream faith, which makes them easier to identify and easier to analyze. The warning signs are visible from a certain distance because there is no legitimate structure surrounding them to obscure the view. Jubilee, the 9th episode of season 3, does something none of those episodes attempt. It places its dangerous element inside a functioning, legitimate, warm religious community, and asks a question that is considerably harder than the ones the show usually asks about this subject. Not what does a cult look like when it arrives from outside, what does it look like when it grows from within, using the same language, the same rituals, the same symbols, and the same structure of authority as the tradition surrounding it. The episode aired on July 28, 1999, which makes it one of the earliest entries in the show's longer argument about cults, predating Super Best Friends by a full 2 years and Trapped in the Closet by 6. It never became famous in the way those later episodes did, partly because it was pulled from the show's streaming library and official website in 2010 alongside Super Best Friends, both disappearing due to the presence of Muhammad in the Super Best Friends lineup rather than anything specific to Jubilee's own content. For years, it remained one of the harder episodes to find through official channels, which contributed to it receiving less sustained analysis than its place in the show's religious catalog actually deserves. Kyle and his brother Ike are preparing to attend Jubilee, a summer camp for Jewish boys organized along the lines of a scouting program. Kyle extends an invitation to Kenny, who has nowhere else to spend the evening. Gerald and Sheila Broflovsky agree reluctantly, with the condition that Kenny attempt to pass as Jewish for the duration of the event. The camp itself is depicted with a specificity and warmth that reflects genuine knowledge of Jewish communal life and tradition. Boys in different age groups are divided into scouts and squirts, the younger children's division. The induction ceremony involves a large bell being placed over each new arrival's head and struck with considerable force, producing a disorienting effect that Kenny's own stubborn resistance to the ritual only makes worse for him. The boys then set about making craft projects, soap sculptures, and macaroni pictures and paper plate bean shakers to be presented as offerings to Moses when he arrives. Moses himself manifests as an enormous glowing presence hovering above a ceremonial fire, designed visually in the style of the Master Control program from the 1982 film Tron. Parker has said in commentary that Moses is his favorite aspect of the episode, and the specific visual choice is worth a moment of attention. Tron's Master Control program is a system that began as a legitimate piece of software and progressively accumulated power for itself, eventually growing far beyond what anyone who created it intended. Using that visual language for Moses, the prophet who received divine law and transmitted it to a community, places an image of something that expanded beyond its original purpose inside the iconography of a figure whose entire significance is as a transmitter of boundaries rather than a violator of them. The joke is gentle rather than pointed, but it sits there in the design in a way that gives the episode's later events a small additional resonance. The elders who govern the camp's proceedings are depicted with a mixture of genuine authority and the slightly officious quality recognizable from almost any organized religious community that has been running long enough to develop its own internal bureaucracy and its own internal factions. They are not corrupt in the way Father Maxie's church is corrupt and do the handicapped to go to hell. They are not extracting money or manufacturing fear. They are people who take their community's traditions seriously and who govern them according to rules they believe exist for genuine reasons. When Kenny is identified by Moses as not Jewish and expelled from the camp, the decision is not framed as cruel so much as procedural. The rules say who belongs. Kenny does not belong. He is sent out into the surrounding forest alone without any adult taking responsibility for where he goes or what happens to him next. This moment is quiet enough that it could be easy to let it pass as simple background plot mechanics, but it is doing something worth slowing down for. The community's exclusion of Kenny is not a cult mechanism. Defining the boundaries of membership is something every genuine community does, religious or otherwise, and the camp's insistence on Jewish identity as the basis for participation is a boundary marker for a tradition trying to maintain its own coherence across generations. But the rigid application of that boundary at that specific moment, sending a child alone into a dark forest in the middle of the night because he does not qualify for inclusion in the group, produces a genuinely harmful outcome that the community's own rules give no one any reason to reconsider. The harm is not intended. It follows directly from the rules being followed exactly as they were designed to be followed. This is a smaller and less dramatic dramatic observation than the one the episode is building toward with Elder Garth, but it sits underneath everything else and gives the story a texture that is more complicated than a simple heroes and villains structure would produce. Elder Garth is the element that turns the episode from a warm portrait of a Jewish scouting community into something that belongs in this video. He is one of the camp's own governing elders, a recognized and apparently trusted member of the leadership structure who has been part of this community long enough to have acquired genuine institutional standing. What has been invisible to the mainstream leadership until very recently is that Garth holds a theological position entirely incompatible with the tradition he appears to be helping to govern. Where the rest of the camp worships Moses and structures its ritual life around the story of Jewish survival and continuity, Garth is devoted to Haman, the villain of the Purim story, the Persian official who plotted the complete destruction of the Jewish people in the 4th century before the Common Era. The Feast of Purim exists specifically to celebrate Haman's defeat. Garth believes that defeat was the wrong outcome. He has spent his time inside the community's legitimate structures, working toward the moment when he can summon Haman into the physical world, trap Moses, and allow everything the camp exists to protect and perpetuate to be destroyed. The mainstream elders are aware that a Haman-worshipping sect exists within their broader community. They formally expel Garth's faction from the gathering early in the episode, a collective institutional response to a recognized theological deviance that the community has apparently been managing as an internal disagreement for some time. What the expulsion does not account for is what Garth is willing to do once the social pressure of community membership no longer provides any incentive for restraint. Inside the community, there was at least some reason for Garth to keep his plans at the level of theological dissent rather than active destruction. Outside it, following the formal expulsion, that reason disappears. He moves immediately toward the most extreme version of what he has been building toward, taking the camp's own elders and children hostage and beginning the summoning ritual that would free Haman and end everything the community has gathered to celebrate. The fact that Garth is an elder rather than an outsider who managed to infiltrate the camp's leadership is the episode's most specific and most important observation about how dangerous fringe movements actually develop within established communities. He did not arrive with hidden intentions planted by some external organization. He rose through the community's own legitimate structures, acquired genuine authority within them over real time, and then used that authority as cover for something the community itself would immediately recognize as its destruction if anyone had been paying close enough attention to notice the direction of his commitments. The mainstream elders expelled his sect as a theological faction. They apparently did not fully reckon with what a person holding those specific commitments might actually do once expulsion removed the last remaining social break on his behavior. This pattern has genuine historical grounding in how researchers who study radicalization within religious communities describe the process. The most dangerous versions of religious extremism rarely arrive from completely outside the tradition they eventually threaten. They develop within it, using the tradition's own vocabulary, its own symbolic framework, its own communal structures and organizational hierarchies as the environment in which they grow. A person building something genuinely threatening within a recognized tradition usually has real standing in that tradition before the dangerous element becomes visible, which is partly why it progresses further than an obvious outsider could manage. The community's own trust in its own structures works against its ability to recognize the problem, until the problem has moved past the point where simple expulsion is an adequate response. The resolution of the episode's central crisis depends entirely on Kenny, who has been in the forest since being expelled from the camp for failing the Jewish identity test that Moses administered almost immediately after his arrival. What Kenny discovers in the forest, beyond being initially captured by a bear who turns out simply to be protecting her cub's birthday party, is the full extent of Garth's plan. He gets back to the camp in time to disrupt the summoning ritual at its critical moment, sacrificing his own life by destroying the conch shell that is keeping Moses trapped, using his own head to break it open. Moses is freed, destroys Garth, and the threat is ended. In recognition of Kenny's sacrifice, Moses formally establishes a new annual observance, at which the camp will gather and honor Kenny's memory through the making of craft projects. The specific ritual language of this specific community applied to the memory of someone who was technically never a legitimate member of it. Kenny's death here carries a different emotional weight from his usual deaths across the series, which function primarily as recurring gags with no lasting consequence. Here, the death is presented as a genuine sacrifice that changes something, that the community formally recognizes and incorporates into its ongoing life. This treatment matters for what the episode is trying to say about the relationship between belonging belonging and contribution. Kenny was expelled from the community by its own rules because he did not qualify for membership under the criteria the community uses to define itself. He saved that same community precisely because he was outside it, in the position to discover what was happening in the forest because he had been sent there. The community's rules excluded the person who turned out to be the most critical figure in its survival on that specific night. This irony is not pressed hard by the episode, which keeps its tone light enough that the observation sits in the background rather than dominating the foreground. But it is there, and it connects to something the show's cult argument has been building toward without quite stating. The mechanisms that make a community feel like a cult, the strict policing of who belongs, the rigid application of membership criteria at the expense of individual well-being, the sense that the community's own continuity matters more than the specific people who happen to be near it at a given moment, are not unique to organizations that researchers would classify as cults. They are features of many legitimate communities as well. The difference between a community and a cult is not that one has rules about belonging and the other does not. It is something more specific and more internal than that, about what the rules are designed to protect and who bears the cost when the rules produce harmful outcomes. Jubilee holds both of these observations at once without resolving the tension between them. The mainstream Jubilee community is genuinely a community, not a cult. Its ritual life is real, its bonds are warm, its leadership is oriented toward the well-being of its members in a way that the episode presents with evident affection rather than mockery. And within that same genuine community, a figure with genuine standing built something dangerous enough to threaten everyone inside it, using the tradition's own language and the community's own trust in its own structures as the environment in which the threat developed. The line between the two is not visible from outside. It was barely visible from inside right up until the moment Garth decided expulsion was the signal to move rather than the signal to stop. This is the contribution Jubilee makes to the show's longer argument about what cults are and how they function. Not every dangerous movement announces itself by arriving from outside an established tradition. Some of the most dangerous ones grow inside traditions, using those traditions' own resources, and the community surrounding them may not recognize the problem until someone is already in the forest alone in the dark, figuring out what the community's own rules prevented anyone else from discovering in time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Jubilee showed how a cult can grow inside a legitimate religious community using that community's own language and authority as cover. The next episode in this story takes the argument somewhere unexpected, asking what happens when the show turns its cult analysis away from religion entirely and points it at a movement built around reason itself, discovering that the machinery of fanaticism runs just as smoothly without a god in the room. Section 7, Go God Go, when reason becomes a religion. Season 10 of South Park arrived in 2006, carrying an assumption underneath it that the show had never quite challenged directly. Across its first 9 seasons, the show had placed its sharpest cult analysis inside recognizably religious contexts, testing its argument against organizations and movements that made claims about the supernatural, about God, about the afterlife, about the nature of the human soul. The implication sitting quietly beneath all of that work was that cult-like thinking needs supernatural belief as its raw material, that a worldview committed to reason and evidence is structurally protected from the same tribal machinery the show had been examining across its religious episodes. Season 10 decided to find out whether that implication was actually true. The setup involves Cartman, who cannot wait 3 weeks for the Nintendo Wii to be released, and who decides to solve this problem by burying himself in snow at the top of a mountain, in a self-administered attempt at cryogenic suspension. The plan goes badly wrong, and he wakes up not 3 weeks later, but 500 years in the future, in the year 2546. The world he finds himself in has achieved exactly what the most committed critics of religion have sometimes described as the ideal endpoint of human intellectual progress. Religion has been entirely eliminated. The world runs on science and rationality. There are no churches, no temples, no mosques, no synagogues, and no theological disputes, because the question of the supernatural has been settled definitively in favor of the people who argued there was nothing supernatural to discuss. This future world is not peaceful. 3 large and heavily armed factions of atheists are in active and violent conflict with each other, fighting a war that has been going on long enough to have caused significant casualties on all sides. The factions are called the Unified Atheist League, the United Atheist Alliance, and the Allied Atheist Alliance, the last of these being composed entirely of super-intelligent sea otters who have also, in the show's future, achieved the kind of advanced reasoning capabilities that put them on equal intellectual footing with humans. Each faction believes the others are wrong about something important. Each faction treats its own position as the only logically defensible one and treats the other faction's positions as evidence of irrationality requiring correction, if necessary through force. The specific subject of the war is eventually revealed, and the revelation is the episode's sharpest single joke delivered with the most serious underlying intent. The three factions are fighting over what atheists should call themselves. The name. Not a theological question since theology has been eliminated. Not a scientific dispute since all three factions are equally committed to science and reason. The war that has consumed this enlightened, rational future civilization is a conflict over terminology, over which of three proposed names for the unified atheist movement is the most logical choice, with each faction convinced that the other two names are so obviously wrong that accepting them would be a form of irrationality incompatible with everything the movement stands for. This is a joke, and it is also a completely serious observation about how group identity functions in the absence of the usual markers that distinguish groups from each other. Religion provides its communities with a set of shared beliefs, shared rituals, shared symbols, and shared narratives about history and meaning that give those communities a coherent identity separable from the communities around them. Remove the beliefs, the rituals, the symbols, and the narratives, and a community built around rationality still needs something to cohere around, something that marks its members as members and distinguishes them from other communities of rational people who happen to have organized themselves under a slightly different name. The joke about the name war is pointing at the way identity needs a flag to rally around regardless of what the flag represents, and at how easily the machinery of tribal conflict, the conviction that the other group is wrong in a way that cannot be tolerated, the willingness to use violence to resolve a disagreement that words have failed to settle, can attach itself to almost any distinguishing marker once the group has enough invested in its own coherence to protect. The episode's origin story for this future world involves Mrs. Garrison and evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, who appears as a character after being hired to teach evolution at South Park Elementary, following Garrison's refusal to cover the topic. Dawkins in real life is the author of The God Delusion, published in the same year this episode aired, which argues for atheism with a directness and a confidence that its critics have described as condescending, and its supporters have described as necessary given the social deference religion has historically received. The episode depicts Dawkins lecturing his students and the adults around them with exactly the tone his critics had described, treating religious belief not simply as incorrect, but as a form of intellectual failure that reasonable people should be embarrassed to hold. Garrison eventually converts to atheism under Dawkins' influence, and the two begin a relationship, and together they set in motion the chain of events that produces the rational utopia turned war zone that Cartman wakes up in 500 years later. The detail that it is Garrison rather than Dawkins who turns atheism into a global mandate is significant. Garrison's conversion is not the product of careful reasoning through the evidence. It is emotional and reactive, driven partly by spite toward the creationist position she had previously held, and partly by the social dynamic of a new romantic relationship with someone whose confidence in his own views is considerable. The future world of aggressive, warring atheism is built on a foundation that includes, near its beginning, a conversion that was motivated at least partly by personal feeling rather than purely rational inquiry. The show is not arguing that Dawkins personally caused the future war. It is arguing that movements built around reason are not immune to the human dynamics that drive all movements, including the dynamic where people adopt positions for reasons that have more to do with identity and relationship than with careful, independent evaluation of the evidence. Parker and Stone describe the production of these two episodes as painful, partly because atheism as a subject was genuinely difficult to make funny without the episode feeling preachy in one direction or another. They removed large sections of material that reflected their own personal positions on the subject too directly, replacing it with less editorial content because they felt the episodes were becoming arguments rather than stories. This tension between the satirical approach and the genuine philosophical questions the subject raises is visible in the finished product, which is funnier and looser than a more carefully argued version of the same material would have been, while still delivering its central observation with enough clarity that it is impossible to miss. Richard Dawkins himself saw the episode and commented on it publicly. He acknowledged that the portrayal of future atheist factions engaged in warfare over minor ideological differences had what he called a certain amount of truth in it, comparing the dynamic to the famous split between the Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea in the film Monty Python's Life of Brian. This acknowledgement from the episode's primary target that the core observation lands is notable. believable, given how strongly Dawkins objected to other aspects of his depiction. He was willing to grant the point about ideological tribalism within atheist communities, while objecting to the parts of the episode he felt were simply personal attacks rather than satire with a genuine target. The Wise One, an elderly sea otter within the Allied Atheist Alliance who pauses during the war to ask whether the conflict is genuinely just, and whether there might be value in allowing some form of belief in the supernatural to meet human psychological needs, is killed immediately by the other otters for raising the question. This is the episode's most direct and most brutal joke about ideological conformity, the one that most clearly positions the future atheist factions as cult-like rather than simply as fractious. A cult, in the show's accumulated argument across these episodes, is characterized partly by its inability to tolerate internal questioning. The moment someone inside the organization asks whether the direction being pursued is genuinely the right one, the organization's response tells you almost everything you need to know about its actual relationship to the values it claims to represent. An organization committed to reason should be able to hear a reasonable question. The Wise One is not raising a challenge to the basic commitment to rationality. He is asking whether the war is worth fighting. The fact that this question is met with immediate lethal force from his own community tells the audience more about what the Unified Atheist League actually is than any of the episode's more explicit jokes do. The resolution of the two episodes depends on Cartman accidentally disrupting the historical events that produce this future by revealing information to Dawkins that causes him to end his relationship with Garrison. Without that relationship, the chain of events leading to global atheism and the subsequent name war never fully develops. The future changes, the three warring factions dissolve into a more peaceful arrangement, and Cartman is returned to his own time, arriving back 3 weeks later than he intended. The lesson he draws from the experience, stated flatly in the show's characteristic style, is that none of this matters because the we is still not out yet. The grand philosophical journey through a failed rational utopia produces no lasting insight in the character who made it, which is itself a small and pointed comment about how thoroughly most people's engagement with large questions is filtered through their immediate personal priorities. What the two episodes add to the show's longer argument about cults is the claim that the machinery of cult-like thinking does not require supernatural belief as its raw material. The Unified Atheist League and its rival factions display every feature the show has been identifying as cult-like across its religious episodes. They treat disagreement with their position as evidence of irrationality requiring correction. They are willing to use violence to enforce ideological conformity. They expel members who raise internal questions. They organize their communal identity around markers, in this case a name, that carry no intrinsic significance but function as loyalty tests precisely because they carry no intrinsic significance. Agreeing with the right name is proof that you belong. Questioning it is proof that you do not. The show's cult argument, taken across all the episodes it has built across its run, has been moving toward this conclusion without quite stating it until Go God Go. The features that make an organization cult-like are not features of its theology, they are features of its relationship to internal disagreement, to the people it excludes, and to the mechanisms it uses to enforce loyalty. Those features can attach to an organization built around reason just as easily as they can attach to one built around supernatural belief, because they are not about the content of what an organization believes. They are about the structure of how it holds that belief and how it treats anyone who holds it differently. This is not an anti-atheism argument. The show is not suggesting that religious belief is superior to a commitment to reason, or that Dawkins is wrong about the things he argues in his books. It is making a narrower and more specific claim, that no belief system, however committed to rationality and evidence, is structurally immune to the tribal mechanisms that produce cult-like organizations. The question that separates a healthy community of rational inquiry from a cult is not whether the community believes in God. It is whether the community can tolerate a wise one asking whether the war is worth fighting, without immediately killing him for raising the point. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Go God Go showed that reason itself can become a cult once the machinery of tribal identity takes hold of it. The next entry in the story stays with Cartman but moves him into completely different territory, showing how the same manipulative instincts he applied to a children's church in season 4 can be pointed at an entire commercial subculture built around faith, with results that expose something sharp about the relationship between genuine belief and the industries that grow around it. Section 8, Christian Rock Hard, Faith as a Market and the Cult of Belonging. Season 7 of South Park aired in 2003, and by that point, point, the show had spent 6 years building a picture of how cult-like thinking operates across a wide range of religious and institutional contexts. It had shown how organizations extract money through manufactured vulnerability, how charismatic figures use borrowed authority to gather followers, how brainwashing redirects loyalty away from genuine relationships, and how tribal identity can harden into something dangerous, regardless of whether the belief system underneath it involves the supernatural or not. What it had not yet examined in any sustained way was the commercial infrastructure that grows around genuine faith. The industry built on top of sincere religious devotion that serves its own financial interests while wearing the language and the symbols of the devotion it is commercially exploiting. Christian Rock Hard is the 9th episode of season 7, and its subject is the Christian music industry, a commercial sector that by the early 2000s had grown into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise with its own chart systems, its own award ceremonies, its own radio stations, its own retail infrastructure, and its own carefully maintained separation from the mainstream music industry that allowed it to operate as a distinct and self-referential market. The episode approaches this subject through Cartman, who arrives at Christian music not through any spiritual awakening, but through a financial calculation so simple and so direct that it functions almost as a parody of market research. He needs to make money from music. Christian music audiences are loyal, underserved by mainstream entertainment, and conditioned by their faith community to support artists who reflect their values. The product Cartman intends to produce does not need to be good. It needs to be Christian enough to qualify for the market, and not so strange that it alienates the buyers. The episode begins with Stan, Kyle, Kenny, and Cartman in a band together that falls apart almost immediately over a disagreement about artistic direction. Cartman makes a bet with Kyle that he can achieve a platinum album before Kyle's band does, with the loser having to perform a humiliating public act as the stakes. Cartman immediately recruits Butters and Token to form a new group called Faith Plus One. The name itself a small piece of branding calculation that positions the band within the genre's expected vocabulary before a single note has been played. He then develops his compositional approach, which involves taking existing popular love songs and replacing the object of the affection with Jesus or God. Every lyric that would normally address a romantic partner is redirected toward the divine, producing songs that use the language of romantic longing, physical yearning, and emotional dependence in a religious context that the genre's audience is conditioned to receive without the discomfort those same lyrics would produce in a secular setting. This technique is not entirely invented for the episode. The practice of adapting the emotional vocabulary of secular love songs for religious use has a long history within Christian music, and critics of the genre had been pointing out this overlap for years before the episode aired. The specific joke the show builds from it is the gap between what the lyrics technically say and what they appear to mean in context, a gap that Cartman exploits deliberately and that the Christian music audience in the episode appears entirely willing to overlook as long as the religious framing is present. Songs about longing to hold Jesus through the night or about the physical desire to feel God's touch are received as sincere expressions of spiritual devotion because the audience brings a framework of interpretation to the music that translates the emotional content into something theologically acceptable before it registers as potentially inappropriate. This is where the episode makes its sharpest observation about how commercial religious culture operates as a closed interpretive system. The Christian music market the episode depicts is not simply a market for music that happens to be made by Christians or that happens to address religious themes. It is a market for music that signals membership in a specific community through the use of specific vocabulary, imagery, and emotional registers that the community has agreed to treat as markers of shared identity. The music functions as a loyalty signal before it functions as art, and the audience's primary relationship is with the signal rather than with the artistic quality of what is signaling. This is why Cartman's entirely cynical product works as well as it does within the market he is targeting. He has correctly identified that the signal is what the market is buying, and he has produced the signal without any of the genuine feeling that the signal is supposed to represent. Faith Plus One becomes enormously successful almost immediately, which the episode uses to make a point about how quickly a commercial religious community can confer legitimacy on something that has not earned it through any process of genuine evaluation. The band's audience does not have access to Cartman's actual motivations. They hear music that uses the right words in the right emotional register and assume the feeling behind it is real because the community's interpretive framework does not include the possibility that someone would produce the signal without the underlying devotion the signal is supposed to represent. This assumption is the vulnerability the episode is examining, and it is a vulnerability that exists in any community that has developed a strong enough shared culture culture to make certain signals automatically trustworthy within its own membership. The cult dimension of the episode is not located in Faith Plus One itself, which is simply a cynical commercial product, but in the broader culture of the Christian music market that makes the product work. A community whose consumption choices are structured primarily around signals of shared identity rather than independent evaluation of quality has created a closed system that functions in ways that share important features with the cult organizations the show has been examining throughout this series of episodes. The members are not being deceived in the same direct sense as people who are told that a personality test will identify their spiritual level and then charged escalating fees to address the problems the test reveals. But they are participating in a market that has substituted community belonging for critical judgment, where the primary question a piece of music has to answer is not whether it is good, but whether it belongs, and where belonging is determined by vocabulary and signal rather than by any independent criterion. Token, who plays bass in Faith Plus One and who is the only member of the band with any genuine musical ability, raises a quiet objection early in the episode that the show allows to sit without resolving it neatly. He points out that what Cartman is producing is not real Christian music because there is no real Christian feeling behind it. The observation is correct and the episode does not contradict it, but the market Faith Plus One enters cannot distinguish Token's objection from the outside, because the distinction between a genuine signal and a fabricated one is not visible in the signal itself. This is the deeper problem the episode is circling. A community that evaluates its cultural products primarily through the lens of shared identity has no internal mechanism for detecting when the signal is being generated without the underlying devotion it is supposed to represent, which means the market is structurally open to exactly the kind of exploitation Cartman is running, regardless of how sincerely most of its participants hold their faith. The resolution of the episode's main plot turns on a specific piece of information about how the Christian music market operates that Cartman has failed to research before entering it. When Faith Plus One achieves the sales threshold that would normally constitute a platinum album in the mainstream market, Cartman discovers that Christian music does not have platinum albums. The awards given within the Christian music industry are named after gifts traditionally associated with the nativity story: gold, frankincense, and myrrh, with no platinum category existing anywhere in the system. Cartman loses the bet with Kyle on a technicality that was present in the market he chose to enter from the very beginning, invisible to him because his research into the market had been focused entirely on the financial opportunity, rather than on understanding the culture he was exploiting with any genuine depth. This ending does something interesting to the episode's overall argument. Cartman's scheme fails not because the community he targeted eventually recognized his cynicism and rejected it, but because the market's own internal structure contains a ceiling he did not know about. Faith Plus One never gets exposed as inauthentic within the episode's world. The audience that bought the music does not discover at the end that Cartman was manufacturing the signal rather than feeling it. The community's vulnerability to this kind of exploitation remains completely intact by the time the credits roll. The only thing that stops the scheme from producing the specific outcome Cartman wanted is a procedural detail about how the market classifies its highest sales achievements. A slightly better researched version of the same scheme, one that did not depend on achieving a platinum milestone specifically, might have run indefinitely. This absence of exposure is part of what makes the episode worth examining alongside the more dramatic cult entries in this series. Most of the show's cult stories resolve through some kind of revelation: the organization's president admitting the whole thing is a scam, the brainwashing being temporarily broken, the charismatic leader's plan being disrupted by an unexpected hero. Christian Rock Hard does not offer that resolution. The closed interpretive system that made Faith Plus One possible is still fully intact and still fully vulnerable to the same approach at the episode's end. The audience that bought the music has not become more capable of distinguishing genuine devotion from manufactured signal. The market that rewarded Cartman's product will reward the next person who produces the same signal with the same cynicism, because nothing about the market structure has changed, and nothing in the episode suggests it will. The subplot running alongside the Faith Plus One story involves Stan, Kyle, and Kenny attempting to form a serious band, and becoming caught up in a campaign against illegal music downloading, joining a group of established artists who are arguing that downloading threatens the livelihoods of working musicians. This storyline ends with the established artists breaking down in tears over the idea that they might not be able to afford additional private jets and vacation homes, a collapse that makes Kyle deeply uncomfortable and eventually causes him to walk away from the campaign entirely. The contrast between the two storylines is pointed. On one side, Cartman is cynically exploiting a religious community's trust by producing a signal of devotion he does not feel. On the other side, wealthy musicians are presenting their desire to maintain extreme luxury as a moral argument about the welfare of artists. Both stories involve a gap between the stated motivation and the actual motivation, with the stated motivation being something the relevant audience is being asked to accept as genuine without any independent means of verification. What Christian Rock Hard adds to the show's cult argument is the observation that the mechanisms of exploitation the show has been identifying across its religious episodes do not require an organization with a formal structure, a charismatic leader, a set of graduated levels of access, or any of the other features the more obviously cult-like organizations in this series display. They can operate through a market, through a commercial culture that has organized itself around signals of shared identity rather than independent evaluation, through the simple fact that a community committed enough to its own shared culture to consume primarily within that culture has created a space where the signal can be produced without the underlying devotion, and the community has no internal mechanism for telling the difference. The Christian music audience in the episode is not stupid or unusually credulous. They are people who have built a commercial culture around their faith community in a way that prioritizes belonging over evaluation, and that prioritization, carried far enough, produces exactly the vulnerability Cartman exploits. Any closed commercial culture organized around identity signals rather than independent quality criteria is susceptible to the same approach, regardless of whether the identity in question is religious, political, subcultural, or something else entirely. The faith in this case happens to be religious faith, but the mechanism the episode is examining is not specific to religion. It is specific to the structure of a market that has substituted community membership for critical judgment, and that structure can be found in many places that have nothing to do with Christianity or with any other theological tradition. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Christian Rock Hard showed how a commercial culture built around faith signals, rather than genuine evaluation, creates a vulnerability that runs independently of any formal organizational structure. Section 9. The Passion of the Jew. How Admiration Becomes a Movement. Released in February of 2004, Mel Gibson's film The Passion of the Christ was one of the most discussed pieces of popular entertainment in the history of American cinema, and not primarily because of its artistic qualities. The film depicted the final hours of Jesus of Nazareth with a graphic intensity that many viewers found spiritually powerful, and many others found deeply troubling, not just for its violence, but for how it handled the specific question of responsibility for the crucifixion. Critics, including scholars of Jewish history and leaders of multiple major religious organizations, raised concerns about whether the film's portrayal of Jewish religious authorities in Jerusalem might reinforce a centuries-old pattern of associating Jewish people collectively with the death of Jesus, a pattern that had been used to justify persecution and violence against Jewish communities across Europe and beyond for more than 1,000 years. Gibson and his defenders rejected this characterization, arguing that the film was a faithful depiction of Scripture and that reading anti-Semitism into it said more about the critics than about the film. South Park aired its response to this entire situation 8 months after the film's release, in an episode that uses the controversy not to settle the question of whether Gibson's film is anti-Semitic, but to examine something more immediately interesting to the show's specific concerns. What happens when a piece of media with that kind of cultural charge gets into the hands of someone willing to use it not as a work of art or as a religious experience, but as a recruiting tool? The episode is called The Passion of the Jew, and its most pointed argument is not about Gibson or about the film itself. It is about the speed with which shared admiration for a cultural object can be organized into something that looks and then functions like a cult. Cartman sees the film and is transformed by it. His transformation is not spiritual in any meaningful sense. He is not moved by the depiction of Christ's suffering or changed in any way that connects to the film's intended theological message. What he responds to is the film's portrayal of Jewish authorities as the primary agents of the crucifixion, which he treats as historical confirmation of the anti-Semitic positions he has been expressing since the show's earliest seasons. The film gives Cartman a sense of external validation he has never had before. His beliefs, which he has always held with confidence but which the people around him have never taken seriously, have now been confirmed by a major Hollywood production seen by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. He responds by doing what he does with every form of leverage he has ever acquired. He organizes it. The fan club Cartman builds around The Passion of the Christ begins with a straightforward enough premise. He wants other people to see the film, to have the same experience experience he had, and to share in the confirmation it provides. He frames his enthusiasm as cinematic and spiritual rather than ideological, positioning himself as simply a passionate advocate for a piece of art he found personally meaningful. This framing is available to him partly because the film itself is genuinely ambiguous on the question of its own intentions, giving Cartman's advocacy a surface plausibility it would not have if he were simply standing on a corner telling people his usual opinions about Jewish people. The film provides cover. The club that forms around shared appreciation of the film provides community, and the community provides Cartman with exactly what every cult leader the show has depicted over its run has sought first: a group of people already oriented toward a shared object of devotion, ready to be directed. The escalation from Film Appreciation Club to something far darker happens gradually and then very quickly, which is itself an accurate observation about how this kind of process tends to work in practice. The early meetings of Cartman's group involve shared enthusiasm for the film, discussion of its imagery and impact, and the social bonding that forms naturally among people who have had an intense collective emotional experience together. Nothing about this early stage would immediately register as alarming to an outside observer. People forming communities around shared cultural experiences is a normal and often healthy social behavior, and the enthusiasm Cartman's group displays for the film is not, at its earliest stages, obviously distinguishable from the enthusiasm of any other passionate audience community. What changes is the direction Cartman gives to that enthusiasm once the group has enough shared identity to be directed. He introduces the idea, gently at first and then with increasing insistence, that the film's message requires action rather than simply appreciation. The shared experience of the film creates an obligation, in Cartman's framing, to address the situation the film has revealed. The club members, already bonded by the intensity of the shared experience and already oriented toward Cartman as the person who brought them together and gives the group its direction, follow this escalation without the critical distance that might have allowed them to notice how far the group has moved from where it started. By the point the episode reaches its most directly satirical sequences, Cartman's fan club has been dressed in matching uniforms and is marching through the streets of South Park speaking German, an image that requires no explanation to communicate its reference. The show does not try to be subtle about where Cartman is steering his group or what historical model he is using as his template. The specific choice to have the group march through the town in a formation borrowed explicitly from the visual language of Nazi Germany places the episode's argument as directly as possible. A fan club for a film about the death of Jesus, organized around shared religious emotion and a specific reading of historical responsibility, has been steered within a single episode's runtime into something that looks and moves like one of history's most catastrophic examples of organized persecution. This compression of timeline is deliberate rather than careless. The show is not claiming that every film appreciation society is a step away from fascism, or that shared enthusiasm for any particular piece of religious media automatically leads to organized violence. It is making a more specific and more uncomfortable claim that the social infrastructure created by shared devotion to a cultural object, the bonding, the shared identity, the willingness to follow the person who gave the group its shape and direction, can be redirected with remarkable speed by someone who understands how that infrastructure works and has a destination already in mind. The group does not choose to become something dangerous. It is steered there by someone who knew where he was going before the first meeting was called. The parallel storyline running alongside Cartman's escalating movement follows Kyle, who sees the film reluctantly and is genuinely shaken by it. Kyle's response is not ideological in the way Cartman's is. He is not using the film as confirmation of existing beliefs. He is genuinely disturbed by it as a religious and historical experience, troubled by the film's portrayal of Jewish authorities in a way that connects to his own identity as a Jewish person. His crisis is real, expressed as a form of guilt that he cannot entirely reason his way out of, despite knowing that the idea of collective Jewish responsibility for the crucifixion is theologically rejected by mainstream Christianity and historically weaponized in ways that have caused enormous harm. Knowing something is wrong does not always make the feeling it produces go away, and Kyle's struggle with this gap between intellectual understanding and emotional response is one of the more honest depictions of how a piece of media with real cultural weight can produce genuine distress in a viewer who brings their own history to it. Kyle eventually seeks out Stan, whose perspective on the film is considerably more grounded. Stan has also seen it, and his primary response is not theological but aesthetic. He found the film gratuitously violent and not particularly enjoyable as a piece of cinema, a reaction that grounds Kyle's more emotionally charged response in the simpler observation that the film's power over its audience is at least partly a function of its intensity rather than purely of its theological content. This does not resolve Kyle's distress, but it gives the episode a counterpoint to both Cartman's ideological enthusiasm and Kyle's genuine spiritual turmoil, a view of the film from someone without a strong stake in either direction. The third storyline in the episode involves Stan and Kenny traveling to Malibu to confront the real Mel Gibson, seeking a refund on Kyle's ticket money. The Gibson they encounter is presented as a deeply unstable figure who derives pleasure from being hurt, a satirical portrait that was built around the erratic public behavior Gibson had already displayed before the episode aired, and which would look considerably more prescient 2 years later, when Gibson made anti-Semitic statements to police officers during a traffic stop in 2006. The show's version of Gibson is not a calculating anti-Semite. He is a chaotic and self-destructive figure who cannot quite be held to account for the consequences of his own work, because his own relationship to reality is too unstable to support the kind of intentional malice the criticism of his film had often attributed to him. This portrayal deflates a certain kind of moral clarity about the film's origins, without resolving the question of what the film does once it is out in the world and available to people like Cartman who know exactly how to use it. The resolution of Cartman's storyline comes through Kyle, rather than through any external intervention. Kyle, having worked through his initial response to the film and arrived at a clearer understanding of what it is and what it is not saying, confronts Cartman's marching group and delivers an argument that cuts the ideological foundation out from under the movement's stated rationale. His argument is simple and direct. Even accepting the film's portrayal of events at face value, the concept of collective inherited guilt for actions taken by specific individuals in a specific historical context is not a coherent moral position. The people marching with Cartman were not there. Their connection to the people who were there is not one that carries forward any meaningful moral responsibility in the way Cartman has been framing it. The entire premise of Cartman's movement, the idea that the film has revealed something requiring action in the present, rests on an argument that does not hold together once examined directly. Cartman's response to having the foundation of his movement challenged is immediate and revealing. He drops the pretense of sincere religious or historical motivation almost instantly, shifting to simple, naked hostility without any of the ideological scaffolding he had been building across the episode. The scaffolding was never load-bearing. It was cover, the same kind of cover the episode has been tracking from its opening sequences. The surface justification that made the group's direction look like something other than what it actually was. When the cover is removed, what remains is much simpler and much older than any argument about historical responsibility for the crucifixion. What The Passion of the Jew adds to the show's longer argument about cults is the observation that a cultural object, a film, a book, a piece of music, can function as a recruiting tool in exactly the same way that a personality test or a fire and brimstone sermon or a street magician's performance can. The shared experience of an intense piece of media creates the social conditions that a skilled organizer can use to build a group with shared identity, shared emotional history, and sufficient deference to its organizer to follow a direction without continuously questioning where they are going. Cartman does not need to manufacture the emotional intensity himself. The film does that work. He only needs to be present at the moment when people who have just had that intense experience are looking for somewhere to direct the feeling it produced, and to make sure the direction he offers feels like a natural continuation of the experience rather than a departure from it. This is also where the episode connects most directly to something the show established through Super Best Friends 8 years earlier. Stan's closing line in that episode about any group that takes your money or control of your life being a cult applies here in a form that removes the financial element entirely. Cartman's Passion Fan Club never charges its members money. The extraction it performs is not financial. It is the extraction of judgment, the gradual replacement of each member's independent evaluation of the situation with the group's shared framework, organized and directed by someone who had a destination in mind before the group existed, and who used the shared experience of a cultural object to build the social infrastructure needed to start moving people toward it. The film itself is not a cult recruitment tool in any deliberate sense. Gibson did not make The Passion of the Christ to give Cartman something to organize around, but the episode is arguing that the distinction between a piece of media's intentions and its uses, once it is out in the world and available to people who did not make it, is not always as protective as the people who made it might assume. The same gap between authorial intent and audience use that the show examined years earlier in the context of the Ginger Kids episode appears here in a different form, with a different kind of consequence. A piece of media built as a religious experience can be repurposed as a recruiting tool by someone who understands how shared emotional intensity creates social conditions remains ready to be organized, regardless of what the people who made it intended. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Passion of the Jew showed how a cultural object can become a cult recruiting tool without anyone who made it intending anything of the sort. The final section of this video draws every thread together, asking what South Park's complete and accumulated argument about cults reveals about how Parker and Stone think about the line between belief and control across nearly 3 decades of episodes that keep returning to the same question from different angles. Section 10, What the Show Never Shows, The Aftermath, and What That Reveals. South Park has spent nearly 3 decades building one of the most sustained and specific popular culture arguments about how cult-like organizations operate. It has shown recruitment, it has shown doctrine, it has shown financial extraction, brainwashing, the way internal questioning gets punished, the way legal threats substitute for honest responses to honest criticism, the way tribal identity hardens into something that can start a war over a name. Across its entire run, across every episode that touches this subject, the show has mapped the machinery of cult involvement with a precision that most entertainment media never attempts. There is one part of the picture the show has almost never addressed. What happens after someone gets out? This gap is not accidental. It is structural, built into the format the show operates within, and understanding it is part of understanding what South Park's cult argument can and cannot do as a piece of public education. A 22-minute comedy episode is an extremely well-suited vehicle for showing how something works at the moment it is working. The recruitment sequence, the internal doctrine, the financial ask, the social isolation, the reframing of outside relationships as threats, all of these can be captured in a few scenes and made immediately legible to an audience that has no prior knowledge of the subject. The show is extraordinarily good at this. The opening of Trapped in the Closet, tracking Stan from the street to a personality test to a paid auditing session in what feels like minutes of screen time, captures a recruitment dynamic that researchers have documented across decades of testimony from former members. What those same researchers have spent equal time documenting is what the person going through that recruitment sequence carries once they finally leave. And that part of the picture, the psychological aftermath of intensive cult involvement, is not something a comedy episode can easily hold. The show keeps resolving its cult stories the way comedies resolve things, with an exit, a confrontation, a clear ending point where the character is free of the organization and can move on. Stan walks away from Blaintology within the same episode that introduced it to him. Kyle's brief involvement with the Passion fan club ends when he confronts Cartman directly. The Super Adventure Club releases its hold on Chef, however briefly, through a visit to a strip club. What actually happens to someone who has spent months or years inside a high control group once they are outside it is a considerably slower and more complicated process than any of these endings suggests. Researchers who specialize in this area have given the specific psychological state that follows intensive cult involvement its own vocabulary. The phenomenon known in cult recovery literature as floating describes a dissociative experience where former members involuntarily re-enter the mental state the group had conditioned in them, triggered by specific words, sounds, or emotional conditions that the group had associated with particular responses during their time inside. These episodes can occur weeks, months, or even years after the person has physically left the organization, arriving without warning in the middle of ordinary life, and temporarily pulling the former member back into a way of thinking they believed they had left behind. Mental health professional and former cult member Stephen Hassan, who developed one of the most widely used frameworks for analyzing high-control organizations, describes the experience of leaving a cult as requiring the reconstruction of an identity that the group has systematically dismantled and replaced. The process is not simply a matter of deciding to think differently. Intensive cult involvement reshapes the way a person processes information, the way they evaluate their own feelings and experiences, and the way they understand their own worth independently of the group's assessment of it. When that shaping is removed, the person is not returned to who they were before. The identity that the group replaced has been gone long enough that rebuilding something in its absence requires time and deliberate effort that bears no resemblance to the clean breaks the show tends to depict. The specific mechanism researchers point to as making this recovery so difficult is described in the academic literature originating with psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton's foundational 1961 work on thought reform. Lifton identified something he called thought-terminating cliches, short phrases or internal responses that cult members learn to deploy automatically whenever a thought arises that challenges the group's framework. These mental shortcuts prevent the critical thinking that might allow the member to examine what the group is actually doing to them, replacing the examination with a practiced internal response before it can complete itself. The insidious feature of these patterns is that they do not disappear the moment the person physically leaves the group. They were installed through repetition over a significant period of time, and they persist through repetition long after the context that produced them is gone. None of this is present in South Park's cult episodes, and its absence is worth naming because the show's picture of what cult involvement looks like is otherwise genuinely accurate in ways that align closely with what researchers have documented. The personality test designed to make everyone who takes it feel broken, the graduated financial commitment required at each level of spiritual progress, the immediate reorientation of the new member's social world toward the group and away from outside relationships, the use of legal threats as a primary defense against public criticism, the specific vulnerability created when a community defined by shared identity cannot distinguish a genuine signal of devotion from a manufactured one. These elements appear in the show's cult episodes with a consistency and a specificity that suggests the writers had done real research, even when they were presenting the information through comedy rather than documentary. The gap is specifically in what happens when the machinery stops running on a specific person. The show's characters tend to exit cult-like situations relatively intact. Stan leaves Blaintology without carrying any visible lasting effects from having been inside it briefly. Kyle walks away from Cartman's Passion fan club without any sign that the experience of being organized and directed by someone with that particular set of instincts has changed anything about how he evaluates future situations. The show rarely leaves its characters damaged by the things that happen to them across a single episode's runtime because the serialized format of South Park requires its main characters to reset between episodes. The boys of South Park are always 9 years old, always living in the same town, always ready for the next situation the writers put them in. This format constraint produces a version of cult involvement that is more legible and more resolved than real cult involvement tends to be, and understanding this limitation is part of understanding what the show's argument can and cannot accomplish in the real world. The show can give a large audience a clear and accurate picture of how the machinery of a high-control organization operates. It can make that machinery immediately recognizable to people who have never encountered an academic or journalistic account of it. It can embed the essential distinction between a community that gives and an organization that takes in a line of dialogue simple enough for a 9-year-old character to deliver convincingly. These are genuine contributions to public understanding of a subject that researchers and journalists have spent decades trying to communicate to audiences that often do not read the books and articles where the full analysis lives. What the show cannot do in its format is show an audience the cost that cult involvement carries once it ends. The cost that researchers describe is not dramatic in the way the show's cult stories are dramatic. It is slow, internal, and often invisible from the outside. A person reconstructing their own identity after years of having it managed by an external organization does not look like someone having an obvious crisis. They look like someone trying to make ordinary decisions and finding the process harder than it should be, or like someone whose responses to normal social situations carry a weight that does not quite fit the situations themselves. That experience does not compress into a 22-minute episode with a clear resolution, which is why it does not appear in South Park's cult episodes, despite being documented consistently by everyone who has studied what cult involvement actually does to real people. The show's contribution, despite this limitation, is considerable, and part of what makes it considerable is precisely that the show did not try to do more than its format allowed. The episodes work as well as they do because they focus entirely on what the format can handle, the mechanics of how cult-like machinery operates on people at the moment it is operating. They do not attempt to capture the psychological aftermath of cult involvement, which they could not do well in comedy format, and they do not attempt to provide the kind of nuanced clinical picture that someone in actual cult recovery would need, which is not what a cartoon is for. What a cartoon is for, and what South Park has done with this subject across nearly 3 decades of episodes returning to it from different angles, is making the shape of something visible to people who would never encounter it otherwise. The BITE model that Hassan developed, describing how high control groups exert simultaneous control over behavior, information, thought, and emotion, is a genuinely useful analytical framework that most people who need it have never heard of. The 8 criteria Lifton identified for thought reform environments, including milieu control, loaded language, and the punishment of internal questioning, are documented carefully enough to be applied as a diagnostic tool by mental health professionals working with cult survivors. And most people in the world have no idea they exist. South Park's contribution is not those frameworks. The show is not a clinical resource and has never tried tried to be one. The show's contribution is something different and in some ways more durable. The felt sense of recognition that an audience gets when the shape of something they have never encountered academically becomes suddenly visible through a piece of entertainment. The viewer who watches Stan walk into a free personality test and emerge 20 minutes later having been told he is spiritually extraordinary and asked to pay for the privilege of discovering more about that extraordinariness, and who feels the shape of that sequence as something recognizable rather than something foreign, is better equipped to notice a version of the same sequence in their own experience than they were before they watched the episode. That recognition does not require knowing anything about Hassan or Lifton. It only requires having watched the show closely enough for the pattern to land. This is what popular culture at its most thoughtful can do with serious subjects that academic and journalistic treatment cannot replicate. Not replace the full analysis, not provide the clinical detail that someone in recovery actually needs, not capture the slow and painful aftermath that researchers have spent careers documenting. Simply make the shape visible to an audience that was not looking for it. Give the machinery a recognizable outline that travels in places the research does not reach. The show did that consistently, across episodes separated by years, returning to the same question from different angles with enough cumulative commitment that the argument built up into something considerably larger than any individual episode could have produced on its own. Whether that argument has made anyone safer from the specific machinery it spent 30 years mapping is a question that cannot be answered through the show itself. But the argument is there, built from comedy rather than clinical research, aimed at an audience that includes children who will not read Lifton and adults who will not seek out Hassan, and shaped by two writers who kept finding new angles on the same fundamental question long after they had made the point clearly enough that anyone paying attention had understood it. The question of what separates a community from a cult was asked first in season 5 and was still being asked in season 23. That sustained return is itself a kind of answer to how seriously Parker and Stone took the subject underneath all the jokes they built around it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.